Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I spent 15 years maintaining the grounds at Riverside National Cemetery, about 40 miles outside of Denver. It was steady work, quiet most days. Just me and my crew keeping the grass trimmed and the headstones clean. The place held over 12,000 veterans, rows and rows of white marble stretching across 90 acres. I'd gotten to know certain sections like the back of my hand, especially Section K where they buried the guys from Iraq and Afghanistan. Families would come every weekend, leaving flowers and little American flags, sometimes photos wrapped in plastic to protect them from the rain. I took pride in keeping everything respectful, making sure the place looked dignified for when people came to visit their loved ones. The whole thing started in early October, right when the leaves were turning that burnt orange color. A woman named Janet Brennan had come to visit her son's grave like she did every Sunday, bringing fresh white carnations from the grocery store. Her boy, Private First Class Michael Brennan, had been killed in Helmand Province back in 2012. She always stayed for exactly an hour, sitting on one of those portable camping chairs she'd bring, just talking to the headstone like he was sitting right there with her. But that particular Sunday, she came running to the maintenance shed where I was cleaning equipment, practically screaming that someone had destroyed her flowers. When I followed her back to Section K, I saw what she meant. The carnations looked like they'd been put through a paper shredder, white petals scattered everywhere, stems twisted and mangled beyond recognition. At first, I figured it had to be kids messing around, maybe some teenagers with nothing better to do on a weekend. I helped Janet clean up the mess and told her I'd keep an extra eye on things. But then it happened again the following week, this time to a family who'd left yellow roses on their son's grave 3 rows over. The Andersons had driven 6 hours from Nebraska to visit Corporal Jake Anderson's resting place, and they found their flowers absolutely demolished. Petals ground into the grass like someone had stomped on them with boots. The weird part was that other flowers on nearby graves were completely untouched. A bouquet of red tulips literally 2 feet away sat there perfect as could be. I started documenting everything in my work log, taking photos with my phone because my supervisor, Tom Garrett, wanted evidence if we were dealing with vandalism. By the 3rd week, word had spread among the families who visited regularly, and people were getting angry. We installed 2 motion-activated cameras near Section K, the kind hunters use to track deer, figuring we'd catch whoever was doing this. The footage showed absolutely nothing, just the flowers sitting there one frame, and then maybe 20 minutes later, completely shredded with no one in sight. Not even wind could explain it because the destruction was too deliberate, too violent. The petals weren't just scattered, they were torn into tiny, almost uniform pieces. Tom called the police, but they basically shrugged and said without evidence of an actual person doing it, there wasn't much they could investigate. Meanwhile, I started noticing a pattern that made my chest tighten every time I thought about it. Every single grave where flowers got destroyed belonged to a soldier who died from friendly fire. I only realized this because I'd been cross-referencing my incident reports with the cemetery's database, trying to find some connection between the affected graves. Michael Brennan, killed when a convoy mistook his patrol for insurgents. Jake Anderson, died from a misidentified drone strike on his position. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The cemetery had maybe 30 or 40 friendly fire casualties, scattered throughout different sections, and every destroyed bouquet sat on one of those specific graves. I didn't tell anyone about this discovery right away because, honestly, it sounded insane even in my own head. How could anyone know which deaths were friendly fire just by looking at the headstones? The markers didn't specify cause of death, just name, rank, and dates. I decided to test my theory on a Monday morning when the cemetery was basically empty, except for me and 2 other groundskeepers working the far sections. I bought a small bunch of daisies from the supermarket and placed them on Staff Sergeant Anthony Russo's grave, another friendly fire casualty from 2009. Then I sat in my truck about 50 yards away, drinking coffee from my thermos and pretending to fill out paperwork while keeping my eyes on those daisies. After about 45 minutes, I got out to check the sprinkler system in the next section over, but I made sure to keep glancing back at Russo's headstone every few minutes. When I walked back an hour later, the daisies were obliterated, white and yellow fragments spread across the grass like confetti. The graves on either side still had their artificial wreaths sitting exactly where families had placed them weeks ago. The situation escalated when Glenn Foster showed up that Wednesday. Glenn was Michael Brennan's squad leader, the one who'd called in the coordinates that led to the friendly fire incident. I recognized him from the memorial service years ago, a stocky guy with prematurely gray hair and this permanent furrow between his eyebrows. He came carrying an expensive arrangement, must have cost him $200 easy, with purple irises and white lilies arranged in a brass vase. He knelt at Brennan's grave for maybe 10 minutes, not saying anything, just staring at the headstone with his jaw clenched tight. After he left, I watched from the equipment shed as usual. This time, the destruction happened faster. Within 15 minutes, those expensive flowers were torn apart so viciously that pieces of purple petals had somehow ended up 20 feet away, stuck to other headstones like someone had thrown them with force. I finally told Tom about the pattern that Friday, showing him my documentation and the list of friendly fire casualties I'd compiled. He went pale when I laid it all out, kept running his hand through what was left of his hair and muttering about how this couldn't be happening. We decided to contact the families privately, starting with Janet Brennan since she'd been dealing with this the longest. When I called her that evening from the cemetery office, she was quiet for a long time after I explained what I'd discovered. Then she told me something that made me sit down hard in my desk chair. She said Michael had been sending her emails for 3 weeks before he died, talking about how angry the Afghan soldiers were about a mistaken attack on their outpost the month before, how tensions were so bad that nobody trusted anybody anymore. The last email, sent 2 days before he died, just said, "Mom, I'm more scared of our own guys than the Taliban." That weekend, something different happened. A retired colonel named Walter Hoffman came to visit several graves in Section K. He'd been the commanding officer for a unit that lost 3 soldiers to friendly fire in a single incident back in 2011. He brought 3 identical bouquets of red poppies, one for each grave, and spent about 5 minutes at each one, saluting before moving to the next. I watched him from a distance, pretending to rake leaves nearby. About 10 minutes after he'd gone, I walked over to check on the flowers. 2 of the bouquets were already destroyed, red petals looking like drops of blood against the green grass. But the third one, on Private David Yuan's grave, was still intact. I stood there staring at it, waiting for something to happen, when I noticed the groundskeeper's note in our database. Yuan's family had requested his body be exhumed and moved to a private cemetery in California just 2 months ago. The grave was empty. Tom and I spent that entire Sunday in his office, going through military records we probably shouldn't have had access to, courtesy of Tom's brother who worked at the Defense Department. We found something that turned our stomachs. In every single friendly fire case where flowers were being destroyed, the investigation had been closed without anyone being held accountable. Administrative errors, fog of war, equipment malfunctions. Always an excuse, never any real consequences. But there were other friendly fire graves in the cemetery, where flowers remained untouched, and in those cases someone had actually been court-martialed or formally disciplined. I kept thinking about those shredded flowers, how violent the destruction was, how it only happened to the flowers on graves where justice had never been served. Tom suggested we bring in a priest, maybe have the grounds blessed or something, but I knew that wasn't the answer. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't about religion. The breaking point came the next morning when I arrived at work to find Glenn Foster's truck parked by Section K again. He was standing at Brennan's grave with another bouquet, but also with something else. a bottle of whiskey, and what looked like a handgun in his waistband. I called Tom immediately and approached Glenn carefully, keeping my voice calm and steady. He was drunk, swaying slightly, tears streaming down his weathered face. He kept saying he was sorry, over and over, that the coordinates had been wrong, that the visibility was bad, that he'd tried to abort the strike but the radio had cut out. He placed the new flowers down gently, then pulled out the gun. I thought he was going to shoot himself right there, but instead, he aimed it at the headstone and started screaming at Michael to forgive him, to stop destroying the flowers, to let him make peace. The flowers exploded into pieces right in front of us while Glenn was still yelling, petals flying up into his face like they were being thrown at him. He dropped the gun and fell to his knees, sobbing into his hands while white carnation petals continued swirling around him in the still morning air. After the police took Glenn away for psychiatric evaluation, and Tom filed his report with the cemetery administration, we made a quiet decision. We stopped replacing the flowers on those specific graves. Instead, we suggested families plant small American flags or leave coins, military challenge coins especially, which seemed to remain untouched. Most families adapted, though Janet Brennan still brings flowers every Sunday. She just doesn't leave them anymore. She holds them while she talks to Michael, then takes them home with her. The destroyed flower incident stopped completely after about 2 weeks. I still work at Riverside, still maintain Section K, but now I understand something I wish I didn't. Some things don't rest easy, especially when justice never came. Those boys died twice, once by enemy fire they never saw coming, and once by friendly fire that never got answered for. Maybe the flowers were just caught in between those two deaths, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist but does, in that space where accountability should have been but never was. Most people think cemetery work is creepy, but honestly, after 6 months as a night watchman at Hillcrest Memorial, I'd gotten used to the quiet. It was March of 2022, and I was pulling my usual shift from midnight to 8 in the morning. The job paid decent, and being 43 with a bad knee from construction work, I wasn't exactly drowning in options. My wife Karen and I had just bought our first house, a little ranch-style place about 10 minutes from the cemetery, and the steady paycheck meant everything to us. The cemetery itself wasn't huge, maybe 15 acres total, with sections dating back to the 1890s. Most nights I'd do my rounds every 2 hours, checking the gates, making sure no teenagers were drinking beer behind the mausoleums, that sort of thing. Pretty standard security stuff, nothing that would make your hair stand on end. The first time I heard the laughter was a Wednesday night around 2:30 a.m. I was sitting in the small security office near the main entrance, eating a ham sandwich and watching some old sitcom on my phone when this sound drifted through the window. Kids giggling, the way they do when they're playing tag or hide and seek. Clear as day, maybe 4 or 5 different voices. Couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old from the sound of it. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, figuring some local kids had snuck in for a dare or something. The sound was coming from the newer section, over by the oak trees on the west side. But here's the thing. The closer I got, the more the laughter seemed to move around like the kids were circling me, staying just out of sight behind the headstones. Then, just like someone hit a switch, complete silence. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. When I swept my flashlight across the area, all I found was disturbed gravel around a cluster of 6 graves, like someone had been kicking at the stones. And get this, there were candy wrappers scattered on top of the headstones. Not old, weathered ones either. Fresh Snickers and Milky Way wrappers, the chocolate smell still hanging in the air. The graves were all grouped together, and when I looked closer, the dates hit me hard. Every single one of these kids had died on the same day, November 14th, 2014. The oldest was 11, the youngest was 7. I picked up one of the wrappers, and it was damp with dew, meaning someone had just left it there within the hour. But there was no way out of that section except past where I'd come from, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone leave. The main gate was locked, the fence was intact, and there were no footprints in the grass except mine. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. What was I going to say? That I heard ghost kids playing in the cemetery? My supervisor, Robert, was a no-nonsense guy in his 60s who'd probably fire me for drinking on the job if I came to him with that story. So I kept my mouth shut and just made a note in the log about finding litter that I'd cleaned up. But 2 nights later, it happened again. Same time, almost to the minute, 2:30 a.m. This time the laughter was louder, more distinct. I could hear individual voices. One kid doing that shrieking laugh when someone's chasing them. Another one calling out something I couldn't quite make out. It sounded so real, so normal, like any group of kids at recess. I practically ran to that section, determined to catch whoever was messing around. This time I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The gravel around those 6 graves wasn't just disturbed, it was arranged in patterns. Little paths weaving between the headstones exactly like kids make when they're playing some kind of game. And the candy wrappers? They were placed deliberately on each grave, 1 piece per kid, all different kinds. Reese's, Kit Kat, Butterfinger, M&M's, Twix, and a Hershey bar. The kind of haul kids get from trick-or-treating. But here's what really got me. There were fresh handprints on the headstones. Small ones, child-sized, visible in the dew that had settled on the granite. I touched one of them, and my finger came away wet. These weren't old marks. Someone, or several someones, had just been here, pressing their palms against the cold stone like they were playing some kind of game. I started doing research on my phone during my breaks. Didn't take long to find the news articles from 2014. School bus accident on Highway 49, coming back from a field trip to a science museum. The bus driver had suffered a heart attack, and the bus went off an embankment. 6 kids from Riverside Elementary didn't make it. The articles had their school photos, bright smiling faces in their best picture day clothes. One girl, Melissa, was holding a certificate for winning the school spelling bee. A boy named Christopher was wearing a baseball uniform, just regular kids, the kind you'd see at any school, anywhere. The articles mentioned that the surviving kids from the bus said they'd been sharing their museum gift shop candy on the ride home, passing bags back and forth, everyone trading their favorites. That detail made me set my phone down and just stare at those graves for a long time. The following Friday night, I decided to wait near those graves before 2:30 a.m. I positioned myself behind a large memorial about 30 feet away, where I could see everything clearly but stay hidden. At 2:15, the cemetery was dead quiet, just the usual sounds of wind through trees and distant traffic on the highway. At 2:25, I noticed something odd. The temperature dropped, not dramatically, but enough that I could see my breath. Then at exactly 2:30, the sounds started again. But this time, being closer and completely still, I could make out actual words. "You're it," one voice shouted. "No tag backs," called another. The sound of feet running on gravel, so clear I could track the movement from grave to grave. And then, I saw the impossible. The candy wrappers on the headstones were moving, lifting slightly as if touched by invisible fingers, crinkling in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. I'll be honest with you. Every rational part of my brain was scrambling for an explanation. Maybe there was some kind of acoustical phenomenon, sounds carrying from somewhere else. Maybe local kids were playing an elaborate prank with fishing line or something. But then I heard one voice, clearer than the others, a little girl's voice that said, "Mr. Bryan, is that you hiding there?" My blood turned to ice water. Nobody knew my name at the cemetery except Robert and the day shift guy. I hadn't introduced myself to anyone else, hadn't worn a name tag, nothing. The voice came again, patient and sweet. "We know you've been watching us. We just want to play. We get so bored." And then another voice, a boy this time. "We brought candy to share, just like on the bus. Don't you want some?" The wrapper on Melissa's grave, the one whose photo I'd seen with the spelling bee certificate, crinkled again, louder this time, insistent. I stood up slowly, my knees cracking from crouching too long, and walked toward the graves. Don't ask me why. Maybe it was the security guard in me. Maybe I just needed to know what was really happening. The moment I stepped into their circle of graves, the laughter stopped, but I could still hear breathing. Multiple sets of small lungs pulling in air, releasing it in little puffs I could see in the cold. "We miss Candy," said a young boy's voice right next to my ear. "Mrs. Patterson always let us trade at lunch, but we can't anymore." I looked down and saw fresh footprints in the gravel, small sneaker prints that weren't there 5 seconds ago. Size 3, maybe size 4, kid-sized. They led from grave to grave in a pattern that made perfect sense if you were playing tag, the kind where you have to run to base, touch it, and run back. That's when I noticed the dates on the candy wrappers. I picked up the Snickers wrapper from Christopher's headstone, and my flashlight caught the expiration date printed on the edge, 12/2014. The candy bar that had supposedly just been eaten was from 8 years ago, but the wrapper felt new, crisp, like it had just come off the bar. The chocolate smell was fresh. I checked another wrapper, the Kit Kat. Same thing, late 2014. These weren't old wrappers that had been saved. They were somehow both old and new at the same time. I heard footsteps behind me, that distinct sound of kids' sneakers on gravel. And when I turned around, there were 6 sets of fresh handprints on the ground, pressed into the gravel like someone had been doing handstands. Small fingers, clearly defined. I knelt down and put my hand next to one. It was barely half the size of mine. When I stood back up, I found a piece of notebook paper tucked under a rock on Melissa's grave. School ruled, 3 holes punched on the side, the kind kids use. Written in pencil in careful elementary school cursive, "We just want friends to play with. M." The next morning, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I drove to Riverside Elementary and asked to speak with Mrs. Patterson. The secretary told me she'd retired in 2016, but gave me an address where I might find her. Patricia Patterson lived in a small blue house with a garden full of sunflowers. When I explained who I was and asked about the bus accident, her eyes immediately filled with tears. "Those were my kids," she said, inviting me in for coffee. 3rd and 4th graders, sweet as could be. She showed me a photo from their Halloween party, just 2 weeks before the accident. All 6 of them dressed as superheroes and princesses, holding pillowcases full of candy. They loved trading candy more than eating it, she said. Every day after lunch, they'd sit in a circle and negotiate trades like little business people. Melissa kept a notebook listing everyone's favorites. She pulled out a small composition notebook from a memory box. There it was, the same handwriting I'd seen on that note listing things like "Christopher loves Snickers" and "Madison only trades for chocolate." I told Mrs. Patterson about what I'd been experiencing at the cemetery. Expected her to think I was crazy, but instead she just nodded slowly. "Other people have mentioned things," she said quietly. "Parents who visit. They find candy on the graves, even when they didn't bring any. Toys moved around. Once Madison's mother found her daughter's favorite hairband on the headstone, the purple one with butterflies she was wearing when she couldn't finish. The first year after the accident, some of the surviving kids from the bus would sneak out at night. Their parents would find them at the cemetery, sitting in a circle around those graves, sharing candy and talking like their friends were still there. They said they could hear them, that they were still playing together. The parents got scared, started locking windows, getting therapy for the kids. Eventually it stopped. But maybe it never really stopped. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much grief. Maybe they're still waiting for their friends to come back and play. That night, I made a decision. I went to the grocery store before my shift and bought 6 different candy bars, the exact ones I'd been finding on the graves. At 2:15 a.m., I walked to that cluster of headstones and placed 1 candy bar on each grave, matching them to what Mrs. Patterson's notebook had shown were their favorites. Then I sat down in the middle of their circle, right there on the cold gravel, and waited. At 2:30, the sounds started again, but gentler this time. No running or laughing, just soft footsteps circling around me. I felt something brush against my shoulder, light as a feather. The candy bars I'd placed began to rustle, and when I looked, each wrapper was opened, but not torn. Peeled back carefully the way kids do when their parents tell them to save the wrapper. The chocolate inside was gone, disappeared completely, leaving only empty wrappers that still smelled fresh. I started talking to them, told them about my day, about my wife's terrible cooking, about the stray cat that lived behind the maintenance shed. And I swear I heard giggles, soft and warm. After about an hour, I stood up to leave and found 6 small objects placed in a neat row where I'd been sitting. A purple butterfly hairband, a tiny baseball card, Christopher's photo from his Little League team, a pencil with bite marks on it, a friendship bracelet made of embroidery floss, a small plastic dinosaur, and a folded piece of notebook paper with a gold star sticker on it, the kind teachers give out. I picked them up carefully, understanding what they were. These kids had traded with me. They'd given me their treasures in exchange for the candy. When I got home that morning, I put those items in a shoebox and placed it on the shelf in my closet. I still have them. After that night, things changed. The sounds continued every few nights, always at 2:30 a.m., but I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd bring candy bars, leave them on the graves, and sit there for a while. Sometimes I'd hear them playing, sometimes just whispers, and sometimes nothing at all, but the candy would always disappear. Other guards started working that shift after I got promoted to day supervisor 6 months later, and 2 of them quit within the first week. Said the cemetery was haunted, that they heard kids laughing in the dark. Robert asked me about it once, and I just shrugged and told him some nights the wind carries sounds from the residential area nearby. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it either. The guard who finally stuck around, a young guy named Kevin, came to me after his first month. "The kids in Section C," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Should I do anything about them?" I handed him a grocery bag with 6 candy bars inside. "Leave these on the graves when you hear them," I told him. "They just want someone to remember they were kids." He nodded and never brought it up again. I still visit sometimes during the day now. Families have started leaving candy on those graves regularly. Word spreads in small towns, even the unspoken things. Especially around Halloween, you'll find the headstones covered in treats. The parents of the surviving kids from the bus sometimes come together, and I've seen them sitting in a circle right there on the ground, sharing stories about all the children, not just the ones who made it home. Last November 14th, on the anniversary, I found Mrs. Patterson there with a grocery bag full of candy bars, placing them carefully on each grave. "They were good kids," she said when she saw me. Still are, I suppose. We stood there together for a while, 2 people who'd learned that some things don't need explaining, just accepting. The cemetery doesn't feel haunted to me. Feels like a playground where 6 kids are still trading candy, still calling tag, still being what they'll always be. Children who never got the chance to grow up, but never really left either. I work nights at Willowbrook Cemetery, just outside of town. Started the job about 8 months ago, after my construction company went under, and I needed something steady to pay the bills. The job posting said night security and maintenance, but really I just drive around in a golf cart, check that the gates are locked, and make sure the new motion sensor lights they installed last year are working properly. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and honestly, most nights I just sit in the little office near the main entrance, watching Netflix on my phone and doing my rounds every couple hours. The cemetery installed those LED motion lights along all the main paths after some vandalism incidents. They're supposed to help me spot anyone who shouldn't be there after dark. Each section has its own grid of sensors, and there's a monitor in the office that shows me which zones light up when something moves through them. Tuesday nights have become a problem. Every single Tuesday, at exactly 2:47 a.m., the lights in Section G start going off in sequence. First the one by the maintenance shed, then the next one about 30 feet down the path, then the next, and the next, like someone's walking that specific route at a steady pace. The path leads straight through the older part of the cemetery, past headstones from the 1960s and 70s, and ends at a modest granite marker near the back fence. I noticed the pattern after my third week on the job, and at first I figured it was just an animal. We get deer sometimes, raccoons all the time, but animals don't walk in perfect straight lines, and they definitely don't keep to the exact same schedule every week. The really strange part is what I see on the security cameras. Absolutely nothing. The lights illuminate empty paths, casting shadows from headstones and trees, but there's never anyone there. After about 2 months of this, I started keeping a log. Tuesday, 2:47 a.m., Section G lights activate in sequence duration, approximately 3 minutes and 15 seconds. Same path every time, same walking speed, never varies by more than a few seconds. I tried everything to figure it out. Checked for underground pipes that might be releasing steam, looked for sprinkler systems on timers, even stayed out there one Tuesday night hiding behind a large monument to see it with my own eyes. When 2:47 hit, the lights started their sequence right on schedule. I watched each one flick on, bright white LED flooding the path, and I swear to you there was nothing there. Just the lights responding to something I couldn't see, traveling that same route like clockwork. The motion sensors are infrared. They detect heat signatures and movement, and they're sensitive enough to pick up a rabbit from 20 feet away. Whatever was triggering them was giving off enough heat and mass to register, but remained completely invisible to both my eyes and our cameras. I started digging into the cemetery records during my downtime, trying to figure out if there was something special about that particular path, or where it ended. Most of the graves in Section G are from families who lived in town during the 60s and 70s. Teachers, shop owners, regular folks. The path that lights up every Tuesday night ends at the grave of a woman named Dorothy Caldwell, died in 1973 at age 29. Her headstone is simple, just her name and dates plus the words beloved daughter and sister. Nothing unusual about it, except that it's exactly where the light sequence stops every single time. I found her obituary in the cemetery's old files. Just a brief mention that she died unexpectedly, survived by her parents and 2 brothers. But something nagged at me about the timing, about why it was always Tuesday nights, always at that exact minute. Last week I went to the town library on my day off. The librarian, an older woman named Grace who's worked there since the 80s, helped me look through the newspaper archives from 1973. We found the article about Dorothy Caldwell's death, and when I read it, everything clicked into place in the worst possible way. Dorothy had been walking home from her job at the town's old textile mill on a Tuesday night in November. She always took the same route, down Mill Road, past where the cemetery's back entrance is now, then along what used to be called Carpenter's Lane. She was struck by a drunk driver at 2:47 a.m., died on impact. The paper said she'd walked that route every Tuesday night for 3 years, always got off her shift at 2:30, always passed that spot at the same time. The driver was never caught. They found her body the next morning, her lunch pail scattered in the ditch, her coat torn where she'd been dragged several feet by the impact. Here's where it gets worse. The path those lights trace through Section G? When I compared it to the old town maps at the library, that path follows the exact route of the old Carpenter's Lane, before they moved it in 1975 to expand the cemetery. The maintenance shed sits right where Mill Road used to intersect with it. Every Tuesday night at 2:47 a.m., those motion sensors are detecting something walking Dorothy Caldwell's route home, the same route she walked for 3 years, the same route where she died, now incorporated into the cemetery where she's buried. I showed my findings to my supervisor, Carl, thinking maybe we could adjust the sensors or something, but he just shrugged and told me not to worry about it. Said the sensors probably had a glitch, maybe picking up temperature changes from the ground or something. But temperature changes don't walk in straight lines at exactly human walking speed. and they sure don't stick to a schedule that matches a death from 50 years ago. Tonight is Tuesday again, and I'm sitting here in the office watching the clock tick toward 2:47. I've tried to rationalize it 100 different ways. Maybe there's some kind of electrical interference on a timer. Maybe the old mill had machinery that still affects the area somehow. Maybe it's just the mother of all coincidences. But I've worked here long enough now to notice other things too. The temperature drops in Section G around 2:45 every Tuesday, even in the middle of summer. My equipment starts acting up. The radio gets static, my phone loses signal, the golf cart's battery meter fluctuates even though I just charged it. And there's this weight in the air, like the pressure change before a storm. Except the weather's always clear on Tuesday nights. Always. I checked the weather records going back 6 months, and there hasn't been a single Tuesday night with rain or storms during my shift. It's like something needs those conditions to be just right. I've started researching Dorothy's life, trying to understand why this keeps happening. Found out she was engaged to a man named Harold Fisher, who moved away after she died. Her brothers are both gone now, passed away in the 90s and 2000s. But I tracked down her nephew, lives about 2 hours away, and he told me something that made everything even stranger. Dorothy was always punctual, he said. Never missed a day of work, never varied her routine. But on the night she died, she'd actually left work 15 minutes early because she wasn't feeling well. If she'd left at her normal time, that drunk driver would have been long gone. The nephew also mentioned that his father, Dorothy's younger brother, used to swear he'd see her sometimes, walking past his house on Tuesday nights, even though his house was nowhere near the cemetery. He said his father eventually moved because of it. Couldn't stand living on what used to be her route home. 2 weeks ago, I decided to follow the lights when they activated. I positioned myself at Dorothy's grave at 2:45 a.m. waiting. Right on schedule, I saw the first light flick on by the maintenance shed, that harsh LED white cutting through the darkness. Then the next one, 30 feet closer, then the next. I walked backward, keeping pace with whatever was triggering them, staying just ahead of each activation. The air got colder with each step, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me even though it was early September. When the sequence reached the grave, the final light bathed Dorothy's headstone in that stark brightness, and I noticed something I'd never seen before. Fresh flowers at the base of the stone. Not cemetery flowers, not the artificial ones families sometimes leave, but wildflowers, the kind that grow along roadsides, the kind Dorothy might have picked walking home from work. I asked Carl about them the next day, but he said the grounds crew hadn't placed any flowers there, and Dorothy had no living relatives in town who visited regularly. The worst part happened last Tuesday. I'd brought a thermal camera from home, borrowed it from my brother who uses it for home inspections. At 2:47 a.m. I watched through the viewfinder as the first sensor triggered. The thermal showed nothing at first, just the cold blue of the path and the slightly warmer headstones that had absorbed heat during the day. But as each light activated, I saw it. A shape in the thermal image, human-sized but barely there, like an echo of heat rather than a source. It moved at a steady pace, that familiar walking speed I'd tracked so many times. The shape wasn't solid, more like a disturbance in the air temperature, a subtle gradient between the ambient cold and something slightly warmer. When it reached Dorothy's grave, it stopped, and for just a moment, the thermal image intensified, showing what looked like a person standing there, facing the headstone. Then it faded, dissipating like breath on a cold morning, and the lights went dark. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, so I did something that might have been stupid. I went back to the library and dug deeper into the accident reports from 1973. The drunk driver was never caught, but there were witness statements from people who heard the impact, saw the headlights speeding away. One witness, a man who lived near the accident site, said he'd been suffering from insomnia and was awake that night. He reported seeing Dorothy walking, then hearing the terrible sound of the collision, then seeing a dark-colored sedan speed past his house. But here's what nobody seemed to notice in the old reports. That witness, Eugene Watts, had been the night security guard at the textile mill. He would have known exactly when Dorothy left, would have known her route, would have known she walked alone. The police never questioned why he was awake at that exact time, looking out his window at that exact spot. Eugene Watts died in 1991, took whatever he might have known with him. His grave is in Section B of this same cemetery, and sometimes when I'm doing my rounds, I notice his section's lights flicker too, but never in a pattern, never with purpose, just random, erratic, like something disturbed. I made a decision last night. I submitted my 2 weeks' notice to Carl, told him I found a day job at a warehouse across town. He didn't seem surprised, said a lot of night security guards don't last long at Willowbrook, though he wouldn't elaborate on why. My last shift is this Friday, and I'm counting down the days, but I did one more thing before I decided to leave. I placed a small plaque next to Dorothy's grave. Nothing official, just something I had made at the trophy shop downtown. It reads, "Your journey home continues, may you find peace at its end." When I placed it there yesterday afternoon, the air felt different, lighter somehow. Tonight, Tuesday again, it's 2:46 a.m. as I write this. In 1 minute, those lights will start their sequence. But something feels different. The temperature hasn't dropped, my equipment is working fine, and there's no pressure in the air. Maybe it's wishful thinking, but I want to believe that acknowledgement matters, that sometimes things just need to be seen and understood. The clock just hit 2:47. The lights in Section G remain dark. For the first time in 8 months, Tuesday night at Willowbrook Cemetery is quiet, and Dorothy Caldwell's path home has finally ended. The rain started around 4 that afternoon, right when I was finishing up the maintenance on the east side of Oakwood Cemetery. I'd been working there for about 6 years at that point, mostly doing groundskeeping and closing up the gates every evening. It was a decent job, quiet most of the time, and I actually liked the solitude. My wife Amy always joked that I preferred the company of the dead to the living, and honestly, after dealing with my previous job in retail, she wasn't entirely wrong. That particular day in late September, I was alone since my coworker Brad had called in sick. The cemetery sprawled across 40 acres, and with the storm getting worse by the minute, I wanted to finish my rounds quickly and head home before the roads flooded. I was heading toward the main gates around 6:30 when I spotted someone near the older section of graves. Through the sheets of rain, I could make out a figure moving slowly between the headstones, stopping occasionally like they were reading the inscriptions. Now, we technically closed at 6, but it wasn't unusual for people to lose track of time when visiting loved ones. The guy was wearing what looked like a dark coat, completely soaked through, and he didn't have an umbrella. Something about the way he moved seemed deliberate, methodical even, like he was searching for a specific grave. I grabbed my flashlight from the maintenance shed and started walking toward him, pulling my hood up against the downpour. The mud was already ankle-deep in some spots, and I had to watch my step to avoid slipping on the wet grass. As I got closer, I called out to him, trying to be polite but firm. "Sir, we're closed for the evening. I need to lock up." The man didn't turn around immediately. He just stood there, facing a weathered headstone from the 1950s, rain streaming down his back. When he finally did turn, I noticed he was probably in his 40s, clean-shaven, with this peculiar scar running from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone. His clothes weren't just wet, they were completely drenched, like he'd been standing in the rain for hours. He looked at me with these pale gray eyes and said, "I know, but I needed to wait until you finished with the Henderson plot." That stopped me cold because I had just been working on the Henderson family section, trimming the hedges and replacing some flowers. Nobody else had been around to see me there. Before I could ask how he knew that, he continued talking in this calm, measured voice. "You always do the Hendersons on Mondays when Brad's here, but since he's sick today, you had to squeeze it in before closing." The rain was hammering down harder now, and I had to wipe water from my eyes to keep looking at him. This stranger knew my coworker's name, knew our work schedule. I tried to stay professional, told him visitor information was private, and he really needed to leave. But he just tilted his head slightly and said, "Amy's making lasagna tonight, isn't she? She always does on Mondays when you work late." The words hit me like ice water. How could he possibly know my wife's name, let alone what she was cooking for dinner? I took a step back, my boots squelching in the mud, and gripped my flashlight tighter. The rational part of my brain was trying to find explanations. Maybe he knew someone from town. Maybe he'd overheard conversations. Maybe he worked somewhere I'd been. But none of that explained the level of detail he had. "Who are you?" I asked, hearing the edge in my own voice. He didn't answer right away, just started walking slowly between the graves, running his fingers along the tops of the headstones as he passed them. "You're going to stop at the gas station on Elm Street on your way home," he said, still not looking at me. "You'll buy a scratch-off ticket, the $5 crossword one, and you'll win $20. You always buy one when Brad's out sick because you feel lucky about the overtime pay." The accuracy was terrifying. I did always stop at that specific gas station, and yes, I had a stupid superstition about buying scratch-offs when I got overtime hours. But I'd never told anyone about that habit, not even Amy. The rain was soaking through my jacket now, but I barely noticed. I pulled out my phone, thinking maybe I should call the police, but the man noticed and shook his head. "Your phone's at 12% battery," he said quietly. "You forgot to charge it last night because you were watching that documentary about serial killers until 2 in the morning. Amy fell asleep on the couch at 11:15. I looked at my phone screen. 11% battery, close enough to make my chest tighten. And yes, I had stayed up watching exactly that, and Amy had dozed off on the couch around 11. The man finally stopped walking and turned to face me fully. The rain had plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and water was dripping steadily from his chin. "You keep a photo in your wallet," he said, taking a step closer. "Not of Amy. The other one, behind your driver's license. The girl from college, Rebecca. You dated her for 3 years before you met Amy. You never told your wife you still carry it." My hand instinctively went to my back pocket where my wallet was. Nobody knew about that photo. It was just a small thing, a memory I couldn't quite let go of, hidden behind everything else. Rebecca had died in a car accident 2 years after we broke up, and I'd kept her picture as a sort of memorial. It wasn't romantic anymore, just something I couldn't throw away. But I'd never mentioned it to anyone, ever. "You need to leave. Now," I said, but my voice came out weaker than I intended. The man just stood there, rain pooling around his feet in the saturated ground. "Your mother calls every Sunday at exactly 7:30, he continued as if I hadn't spoken. "But you let it go to voicemail half the time because she always asks when you and Amy are going to have kids, and you don't want to tell her about the fertility treatments that aren't working." That one hit hard. We'd been trying for 2 years, spent thousands on treatments, and hadn't told our families yet. The disappointment was too raw, too private. I started backing away toward the maintenance shed, thinking I could lock myself in and call 911 from the landline there. But the man called after me. "The shed door sticks. You have to lift and pull at the same time. You've been meaning to fix it for 4 months." I ran. I didn't care about dignity or protocol anymore. I just ran through the rain and mud toward my truck parked by the main entrance. Behind me, I could hear the man's voice, steady and unhurried. "You're going to slip near the Morrison Monument. There's a route there you always forget about." Sure enough, my foot caught on something and I went down hard, my knee slamming into a gravestone. Pain shot up my leg, but I scrambled back up, limping now, covered in mud and grass. When I glanced back, the man was following but not running. Just walking at that same measured pace, like he knew exactly where I was going and how long it would take me to get there. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely get my keys out of my pocket. I finally reached my truck and yanked the door open, slamming it shut and hitting the locks immediately. Through the rain-blurred windshield, I could see him standing about 20 feet away, just watching. I started the engine, and that's when he did something that made my whole body go rigid. He held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. Right as his last finger went down, my engine sputtered and died. I turned the key again. Nothing. The man walked closer, stopping right by my driver's side window. "Alternator," he said, loud enough for me to hear through the glass. "It's been making that whining sound for 3 weeks. You were planning to get it fixed this weekend." He was right. The truck had been making that sound, and I had an appointment at the shop for Saturday. The man pressed his palm flat against my window, and I could see every line in his hand through the rain-streaked glass. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, and for some reason I believed him. There was something in his tone, almost sad, like he was carrying out some obligation he didn't enjoy. "I just needed you to understand that someone is always watching, always knowing. You're going to go home tonight, hug Amy, and not tell her about this. You're going to fix your truck, come back to work, and pretend this never happened. Because if you don't..." He didn't finish the sentence, just removed his hand from the window, leaving a perfect handprint in the condensation. Then he turned and walked back into the cemetery, disappearing into the rain and darkness between the headstones. My truck started on the next try, as if nothing had been wrong with it at all. I drove home in a daze, stopped at the gas station out of some bizarre compulsion to see if he was right, and bought that scratch-off. $20 winner. At home, Amy had indeed made lasagna, and I hugged her so tight she asked if everything was okay. I told her it had just been a long day. That was 8 months ago. I still work at the cemetery, still close up most nights. I've never seen the man again, but sometimes I find things. A flower placed on a grave I just cleaned, footprints in areas I just raked, little signs that someone has been there. I looked through all our records, checked security footage from nearby businesses, even hired a private investigator with my savings. Nothing. No explanation. All I know is that somewhere out there, someone knows every detail of my life, and I'll never understand why they chose that night to let me know it. Last summer changed everything for me. I was 17, living in a small college town in Iowa with my parents and younger sister. Life was predictable. Summer job at the hardware store, hanging out at the mall, sneaking beers at house parties when someone's parents were out of town. I had this tight group of friends I'd known since middle school. There was Jason, who was obsessed with his YouTube channel where he posted urban exploration videos that maybe got 50 views each. Courtney, who drove us everywhere in her beat-up Ford Explorer. And Lucas, the quiet one who went along with whatever we planned. That particular night in early August, Jason had been begging us for weeks to help him film something actually interesting for his channel. He'd found this old cemetery on the outskirts of town, Fairview Memorial, that dated back to the 1800s. The place had been mostly forgotten, surrounded by cornfields and accessible only by a dirt road that the county barely maintained anymore. The four of us met up around 11 that night at the 24-hour gas station near the interstate. Jason had his camera equipment. Nothing fancy, just his phone with a stabilizer and a GoPro he'd gotten for Christmas. Courtney picked us up, and we drove out there with the windows down, listening to music and joking about how Jason was going to become YouTube famous from filming some old graves. The cemetery gates were chained shut, but there was a gap in the fence about 50 yards down where the wire had been cut and rolled back, probably by other kids who'd had the same brilliant idea. We squeezed through one by one, Jason filming the whole time, narrating in this fake dramatic voice about entering the realm of the dead, while we laughed and told him to shut up. The moon was almost full that night, bright enough that we could see the rows of weathered headstones stretching out across maybe 3 or 4 acres. Some were so old, the names had worn away completely, just smooth stone rectangles sticking up from the overgrown grass. We spent about an hour wandering around, being idiots basically. Lucas found this massive oak tree in the center, with roots that had pushed up through several graves, creating these weird bumps and valleys in the ground. Jason was getting footage of everything. The crumbling angel statues, the family plots with those little iron fences around them. This one headstone from 1847 that just said baby girl with no other information. Courtney kept reading the inscriptions out loud in different voices, making up stories about how each person died. "Here lies Ezekiel Thompson," she'd say in this old-timey accent. "Choked on a chicken bone at Sunday dinner." We were trying to keep quiet since there were houses maybe a quarter mile away, but we kept cracking up at stupid stuff. At one point, Lucas pretended to rise from behind a headstone like a zombie, and Jason nearly dropped his phone trying to film it while laughing. The whole thing felt like any other night we'd spent together that summer, just messing around, killing time. Jason decided he needed some solo shots for his video intro, so he had me hold the GoPro while he walked between the graves doing his narrator thing. That's when things started to feel different, though I didn't really notice it at the time. While I was filming Jason, Courtney and Lucas had wandered off toward the back section where the older graves were. The cemetery sloped down there into a little valley where the grass grew thicker, and the headstones were mostly those thin slate ones that lean at weird angles. Jason was about 20 feet away from me, walking backwards while talking to the camera. When Courtney called out that she'd found something cool, we jogged over to where they were standing around this old mausoleum built into the hillside. The thing was maybe 12 feet wide, made of limestone blocks that had turned gray and streaky from weather. The metal door was slightly open, just a few inches, and you could see the rusty chain that was supposed to keep it shut had been broken for who knows how long. Jason immediately wanted to film inside, but even he wasn't dumb enough to actually go in there. The gap in the door was just wide enough to stick the phone through, so that's what he did, using the flashlight to record whatever was in there. We all crowded around the little screen to watch. It was mostly empty, just stone shelves on the walls where coffins would have been placed, some old leaves blown into the corners, and what looked like beer cans from other people who'd been there before us. While Jason was filming, I remember Lucas kept looking around, not nervous exactly, but the way you do when you're waiting for someone. He asked if we heard that, and we all stopped talking to listen. It was just crickets and wind through the corn in the nearby fields. Courtney made fun of him for being paranoid, but I noticed she stayed closer to the group after that. We decided to head toward the front section again, where the newer graves were and where we'd have better light from the street lamps on the main road. The last 20 minutes we were there, Jason had us do this stupid thing where we'd each stand by a different headstone while he panned the camera across, like some artsy shot for his video. I was leaning against this tall obelisk-style monument for some family called the Washburns, trying not to laugh, while Jason directed us like he was filming a real movie. Courtney was maybe 30 feet to my left, sitting on the base of a big cross, and Lucas was further out, standing by the fence. Jason walked backwards slowly, keeping us all in frame with his phone, narrating some nonsense about the living among the dead or whatever. That's the footage I can't stop thinking about now. While Jason was filming that wide shot, moving the camera from left to right across all three of us, he captured something else. Behind me, behind Courtney, even behind Lucas at different points. We didn't see anything that night, I swear we didn't. But the camera did. We left around 12:30, squeezing back through the fence and piling into Courtney's Explorer. The ride home was typical. Jason reviewing his footage in the passenger seat, already talking about editing and what music he'd use, while Lucas and I sat in the back making jokes about how we'd probably all get haunted now. Courtney dropped me off last since I lived furthest from downtown. I remember walking up my driveway, seeing my parents' bedroom window was dark, relieved I'd made it home without getting caught. The next day was Saturday, and I worked a morning shift at the hardware store, sold some paint and lumber to contractors, normal stuff. Jason texted our group chat around noon saying he'd started editing the video and it was looking sick. I didn't think about the cemetery again until Sunday evening when Jason called me directly, which was weird because he usually just texted. His voice sounded different, kind of flat and confused. He asked if I could come over right away, said he needed to show me something about the footage. I drove over to Jason's house around 7. His parents were at some dinner thing, and I found him in his room with his laptop open, the editing software paused on a frame from Friday night. Lucas was already there, sitting on the bed looking uncomfortable. Jason didn't say anything at first, just hit play on a clip. It was the footage from when we first entered through the fence, all 4 of us squeezing through and laughing. But there, maybe 15 feet behind us in the frame, barely visible between 2 headstones, was a person, just standing there, watching us come in. The figure was wearing something dark, maybe a jacket or coat, and they were perfectly still. Jason rewound it, played it again. The person was definitely there, positioned in a way where they could see us but we couldn't see them. "Keep watching," Jason said, and clicked to another clip. This one was from when I was filming him doing his narrator walk. In the background, moving between the graves parallel to Jason but staying behind the larger monuments, was the same figure. Jason had gone through all the footage from that night, both his phone and the GoPro, and found the person in at least 12 different clips. Never in the foreground, never obvious, but always there. When we were at the mausoleum, they were crouched behind a cluster of headstones about 40 feet away. When Jason was filming us doing that final wide shot, the figure appeared behind each of us at different times, ducking down whenever Jason's camera moved in their direction. The worst part was this one clip where Courtney and Lucas had wandered off to the old section. While I was holding the GoPro and talking to Jason, you could see the figure in the background, much closer than in the other clips, maybe only 10 feet behind me. They were standing next to this tall memorial, and for about 3 seconds, you could make out more details. It looked like a man, middle-aged maybe, wearing a dark windbreaker and jeans. His face was partially visible, and he was staring directly at me, not at Jason, who was doing all the talking, but at me specifically. Jason zoomed in as much as he could, but the image got too pixelated to make out facial features clearly. We called Courtney immediately and told her to come over. While we waited, the 3 of us went through the footage frame by frame, and it got worse. The person knew where our cameras were pointed at all times. They moved when we moved, stopped when we stopped, always maintaining these perfect positions to stay hidden from our direct view but visible to the camera. In one shot where Lucas was pretending to be a zombie, rising up from behind a headstone, you could see the figure had moved to a spot right behind where Lucas had been crouching just seconds before. If Lucas had looked back before standing up, they would have been face to face. Courtney arrived and went pale when we showed her everything. She pointed out something we'd missed. In the clip where she was reading the funny inscriptions, there was a moment where she'd spun around quickly because she thought Lucas was behind her trying to scare her. But Lucas was actually 20 feet away looking at other graves. In the footage, you could see why she'd turned. The figure had been approaching her from behind and had just ducked behind a headstone when she started to turn. We spent the next hour trying to figure out what to do. Lucas wanted to call the police, but what would we say? That someone was in a public cemetery at the same time we were trespassing there. Jason was freaking out about whether to delete everything or save it as evidence of something. Courtney kept going back to one particular clip, the last one Jason had filmed as we were leaving. Showed us walking toward the fence gap, and the figure was following us, staying about 30 feet back, stopping behind monuments whenever one of us glanced around. But right before the video cut off, just as Jason lowered his phone, the figure had started moving faster, like they were going to follow us through the fence. That's when Courtney remembered something that made everything worse. When we'd gotten back to her Explorer that night, she'd had to adjust her rearview mirror because someone had bumped it. We'd assumed Lucas had hit it getting into the back seat, but Lucas had gotten in on the other side. Someone had been close enough to our car to touch it, maybe looking inside, maybe trying the doors. We'd driven away completely unaware that this person might have been right there in the parking area with us. The 4 of us agreed not to post anything online, and to tell our parents if anything else weird happened. For about a week, nothing did. Then Courtney found something that still makes me sick to think about. She'd been cleaning out her Explorer, and found a receipt under the passenger seat that wasn't hers. It was from a gas station dated the night we'd gone to the cemetery, time-stamped at 11:47 p.m., while we were still there. The receipt was for a coffee and a disposable phone charger. But here's the thing that really got us. The gas station was the same one where we'd met up that night. Someone had been there when we were, had probably watched us leave, maybe even followed us to the cemetery. We went back to Jason's footage from when he'd filmed us arriving at Fairview, and there it was. A pair of headlights way back on the dirt road, turning off right after we'd parked. We'd thought it was just someone using the road to turn around. Now we knew better. We never found out who it was or what they wanted. We filed a police report eventually, but nothing came of it. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, following other groups of kids with their cameras, staying just out of sight, waiting for, I don't even know what. The July heat in 2016 was brutal in our small Montana town, the kind that made the asphalt bubble and the air shimmer like water. I was 17, spending most of my days at my buddy Connor's place because his parents had central air and mine didn't. We'd been friends since middle school, both of us outcasts who bonded over skateboarding and trying to find anything interesting to do in a place where the most exciting event was the annual corn festival. Connor had this wild red hair that stuck up no matter how much gel he used, and freckles that covered every inch of his pale skin. That particular Thursday, we were sprawled on his basement floor, scrolling through our phones, when Connor suddenly sat up with that look in his eyes that always meant trouble. "Dude, you know that old Greenwood cemetery off Route 84? The one with the abandoned funeral home next to it?" he said, showing me some urban exploration forum on his phone where people were posting photos of the place. I knew exactly which cemetery he meant. Everyone in town did, though most people drove past it without a second glance. The place had been partially operational until about 5 years before, when the funeral home shut down after some financial scandal with the owner. Now the cemetery only did burials for people who already had family plots there. Maybe 1 or 2 funerals a year max. The funeral home itself, a massive Victorian-style building with peeling white paint and broken shutters, sat right at the edge of the property like some kind of guard tower. Connor was already pulling up more photos on his phone, showing me shots of elaborate old headstones and mausoleums that looked like tiny churches. "We should check it out tonight," he said. And even though every rational part of my brain said it was a terrible idea, the boredom was crushing enough that I heard myself saying yes. We made plans to meet at midnight, telling our parents we were sleeping at each other's houses. The oldest trick in the book, but it always worked because both sets of parents trusted us not to do anything too stupid. Around 11:45 that night, I slipped out through my bedroom window and jogged the 8 blocks to Connor's house, where he was already waiting by the curb with his dad's flashlight and a backpack full of snacks like we were going on some kind of camping trip. The walk to the cemetery took about 40 minutes, following the main road until it turned into the older highway that led out of town. There were no streetlights once we passed the last subdivision, just the occasional car heading who knows where at that hour. The temperature had dropped to something bearable, probably mid-70s, and crickets were going absolutely crazy in the fields on either side of us. Connor kept talking the whole way, nervous energy making him ramble about random stuff. His sister's new boyfriend, some game he wanted to buy, whether we thought Mr. Peterson would fail him in chemistry. But when we finally saw the cemetery gates appearing in the darkness, both of us went quiet. The main entrance had been chained shut, but the fence along the side was only about 4 feet high, decorative iron with spikes on top that looked intimidating, but were spaced far enough apart that we could easily climb over between them. The cemetery itself was bigger than it looked from the road, stretching back into darkness with rows and rows of headstones in various states of decay. Some sections were well maintained, with fresh flowers and neatly trimmed grass, while others had been completely overtaken by weeds and wildflowers that reached up to our waists. Connor immediately started taking pictures with his phone. the flash lighting up names and dates from the 1800s. Elaborate carved angels and crosses that probably cost more than my parents' car when they were made. We stuck to the main path at first, gravel crunching under our sneakers. But then Connor spotted the funeral home looming against the sky and started heading straight for it. The building was even creepier up close, 3 stories tall with a wraparound porch that had partially collapsed on one side. Most of the windows were boarded up, but a few on the ground floor had been broken, leaving dark holes that seemed to swallow the beam of Connor's flashlight when he shined it through. "Holy shit, look at this," he whispered, pointing to a side door that was hanging open, barely attached to its hinges. The smell hit us before we even got close. Mildew, rot, and something chemical underneath, like old formaldehyde maybe. We were debating whether to actually go inside when we heard it. Footsteps on gravel coming from somewhere behind the building. Not running, just walking steady and deliberate, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. Connor grabbed my arm and we ducked behind a large headstone, both of us trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The footsteps got closer, and then we saw him. A man, probably in his 50s or 60s, wearing dark work clothes and carrying what looked like a camping lantern that wasn't lit. He had thinning gray hair that hung down to his shoulders and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in months. But what really got me was how he moved through the cemetery, not using any light, navigating between the headstones like he'd walked this path 1,000 times before. He went straight to the funeral home's side door, the one we'd just been looking at, and disappeared inside. Connor and I stayed frozen behind that headstone for what felt like forever but was probably only a minute or two, waiting to see if he'd come back out. When he didn't, Connor whispered that we should leave, but then we saw a light flicker on in one of the second-floor windows, a warm orange glow like from a lantern or candle. Curiosity won out over common sense, and we crept closer to the building, staying in the shadows of the larger monuments. Through one of the broken first-floor windows, we could hear the man moving around upstairs, footsteps creaking on old floorboards, and what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. Then we heard something that made us both stop breathing. Another voice, younger, maybe our age or a little older, saying something we couldn't quite make out. The older man's voice responded, louder and aggressive, almost angry. "I told you to wait in the room. You don't go anywhere unless I say so." There was more movement, faster now, and the younger voice again, this time clearly distressed, almost pleading. Connor was already backing away, pulling at my shirt, but I couldn't move. The man's voice got louder. "You wanted to see real history, didn't you? You wanted the full experience. This is what you asked for." A door slammed somewhere inside, hard enough that we could hear it echo through the empty building. That broke whatever spell had me rooted in place, and Connor and I ran, not caring anymore about being quiet, just needing to get away from that building and whatever was happening inside it. We didn't stop running until we hit the main road, both of us doubled over and gasping for air. Connor's face was pale even in the darkness, and he kept looking back toward the cemetery like he expected that man to come chasing after us. "We need to call the cops," he kept saying, but with what phone? We were 2 teenagers who'd broken into a cemetery at night. Who was going to believe us? Plus, we didn't even know for sure what we'd witnessed. Maybe it was just some homeless guy yelling at another homeless guy. Maybe they were urban explorers like us, and the older one was just pissed about something. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew something was deeply wrong about what we'd heard. The way that younger voice had sounded, the aggression in the man's tone, the mention of showing someone real history. None of it sat right. We walked back to town in complete silence, both of us jumping at every car that passed, every shadow that moved. When we finally made it to Connor's house around 2 a.m., we sat on his front steps for another hour, trying to decide what to do. Eventually, we agreed to sleep on it and figure it out in the morning, but I don't think either of us actually slept that night. The next day, Connor called me around noon, his voice shaking. "Dude, you need to see this," he said. "Come over right now." When I got to his house, he had his laptop open to a local news site. The headline made me feel like I'd swallowed ice. Police searching for missing college student last seen in Granite Falls area. The article was about a 19-year-old named Wesley Huang from the State University, who'd told his roommate he was going to explore some abandoned buildings for his photography class and never came back. That was 3 days ago. Connor had already opened 5 other tabs, all missing persons cases from the last 2 years, all young people between 16 and 21, all last seen in or around our town. But what really got us was the Facebook post Connor found from a community group, dated 6 months earlier. A woman named Sharon Vance had written this long, angry post about a man who'd approached her teenage son at the skate park, talking about the fascinating history of the old cemetery and funeral home, offering to give him a private tour at night when the real atmosphere could be experienced. She'd included a photo from her doorbell camera of the man when he'd apparently come to her house looking for her son after he'd declined, gray shoulder-length hair, unkempt beard, probably late 50s. It was definitely the same man we'd seen. Connor's hands were literally trembling as he scrolled through more posts in the community group. There were at least 7 different people over the past year warning about a man matching that exact description, hanging around places where teenagers gathered. The skate park, the mall parking lot, the 24-hour diner on Route 84. He always had the same approach, talking about local history, especially the cemetery and funeral home, offering to show people things the public doesn't get to see. One father, James Novak, had commented that he'd filed a police report after the man had approached his daughter Kelsey and her friends at a gas station, but the cops said they couldn't do anything since he hadn't technically committed a crime. The man had given Kelsey a name, Richard Toomey, and said he was a local historian writing a book about funeral practices in rural America. But when Mr. Novak searched that name, he found something disturbing. A Richard Toomey from Illinois who'd served 8 years for kidnapping and false imprisonment back in 2003. The photos from the conviction were old and grainy, but the face structure was similar enough. The guy had been released in 2011 and apparently dropped off the radar until these posts started appearing. We spent the next 2 hours going down a rabbit hole of information, and every new detail made things worse. Connor found an archived news article from 2015 about the funeral home. Apparently, it had been broken into multiple times after closing, with reports of squatters and evidence of people staying there for extended periods. The police had supposedly sealed it up, but obviously that hadn't worked. Then I remembered something that made me physically sick. The younger voice we'd heard had sounded distressed but not surprised, like they'd been there for a while already. Wesley Huang had been missing for 3 days. What if he'd been in that building the whole time? Connor was already dialing 911, but I stopped him. We needed to think about this carefully. If we called in an anonymous tip, they might not take it seriously. If we gave our names, we'd have to admit to trespassing, and our parents would lose their minds. But then Connor pulled up Wesley's Facebook page, and seeing his face, just a normal kid with a bright smile wearing a university hoodie, arms around friends at some party, made the decision for us. Connor called the police, putting on his most adult voice, and told them he'd seen suspicious activity at the old Greenwood Cemetery, specifically someone going in and out of the abandoned funeral home at night, and that it might be connected to the missing college student. The dispatcher asked a bunch of questions that Connor tried to answer, without giving away too much about why we'd been there. He said we'd been driving past, even though neither of us could legally drive yet, and saw lights in a building that was supposed to be abandoned. She said they'd send someone to check it out and took Connor's phone number, though he gave her a fake name. Probably stupid, but we were panicking. We spent the rest of the afternoon refreshing the news sites and the police department's Facebook page, waiting for any update. Around 6 p.m. it came. Police activity at Greenwood Cemetery, area closed to public. Then, an hour later, the update that made us both nearly throw up. Missing university student found alive, suspect in custody. They didn't release many details that night, but the next morning, the full story broke. Richard Toomey, 62, had been arrested and charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and assault. He'd been living in the funeral home's basement for months, had set up a makeshift living space with a generator for power, and had been luring young people there with promises of historical tours and ghost hunting experiences. Wesley had been held in an old embalming room for 3 days, and there was evidence suggesting he wasn't the first. The news reports over the following weeks revealed the full scope of what had been happening. Toomey had been approaching teenagers and college students for over 18 months, though Wesley was the first one they could prove he'd actually kidnapped. The others had either gotten away when things felt wrong or had been released after shorter periods for reasons that weren't made public. The prosecutor said Toomey had an obsession with what he called teaching real history through experience, which apparently meant trapping kids in that funeral home and subjecting them to bizarre lectures about death, burial practices, and his own twisted philosophy about understanding mortality. Wesley testified that Toomey would keep him locked in different rooms, forcing him to listen to hours-long rambling monologues about embalming techniques, showing him old funeral equipment, making him lie in coffins. It was psychological torture disguised as education. Connor and I never told anyone we were there that night, and honestly, the guilt of not going inside to help still eats at me sometimes. But the police said Wesley was rescued within hours of our call, and that's what matters. Toomey got 25 years, and the funeral home was demolished last year. I still drive past that cemetery sometimes, and every single time I think about that young voice we heard and wonder how many others there might have been who were too scared or ashamed to come forward. Wesley's doing okay now, from what I've heard. He transferred to a different school and is studying to become a social worker, wanting to help other trauma survivors. As for Connor and me, we never went urban exploring again, and we definitely never talked about that night without both of us ending up unable to sleep for days afterward. I was in my second year of college when this happened, majoring in visual arts and trying to put together a photography series for one of my studio classes. At the time, I didn't have much of a social life. I was the kind of person who'd rather spend hours fiddling with camera settings than go to parties. My professor had given us complete freedom to choose a theme, and I thought photographing old cemeteries would capture the mood I wanted. Quiet, forgotten places where time seemed to pause. The one I picked wasn't far from campus, a small-town cemetery surrounded by tall iron fencing and a scattering of oaks that leaned as if they were tired from holding centuries of history. That afternoon, the weather was perfect for the look I wanted. The sky was gray enough to soften the light, and there was a cool wind that kept the air restless. I set up near a row of crooked headstones, adjusting the lens to get the texture of the stone and the way moss clung to the carvings. My bag was on the ground beside me, full of extra lenses and a cheap thermos of coffee. Everything felt normal, just another quiet day spent in my own little world with the camera as company. I didn't notice anyone else around, at least not at first. I snapped dozens of photos before taking a break to review them on the tiny screen. Most of them looked how I hoped: muted tones, sharp details, eerie atmosphere. But when I zoomed into one frame, my breath caught for a second. In the far left corner, almost blending into the background, stood a man. He wasn't near the headstones I had been focused on. He was further back, under one of the trees. His posture was strange, too upright, too deliberate. I couldn't make out his face because of the shadows, but the outline was clear enough. I glanced up from the camera, half expecting to see him still standing there, but the space under the tree was empty. I told myself I must have captured someone passing by without noticing. Maybe another student with the same idea, or a local cutting through the grounds. I shook it off and kept working, crouching lower to get different angles. But the thought of that figure stayed in the back of my mind, nagging like a word I couldn't quite remember. When I checked the next batch of shots, my chest tightened again. The man was there once more, this time not beneath the tree but closer, standing near a cracked monument that leaned sideways. He was still in the background, but his position had shifted in a way that felt deliberate, like he wanted to be noticed only after I'd looked back at the photos. The strangest part was how consistent his figure looked from one frame to the next, as if he hadn't moved naturally, but had just appeared in a new spot. I scanned the grounds more carefully, walking a few steps to each side, but the place was silent. The cemetery was big enough that someone could disappear behind the mausoleums or stone walls, yet the stillness around me didn't match the idea of a person wandering nearby. The only sounds were my own footsteps crunching dead leaves and the faint creak of branches rubbing together. I called out a quick hello, even though I wasn't sure why. Maybe to reassure myself that whoever it was would answer. No one did. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to admit I was spooked. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe my lens catching a shadow in a way that looked human. So I kept going, forcing myself to focus on the project. I took wide shots of the older section where the stones were eroded into barely legible shapes. When I looked at those pictures, though, my stomach tightened. The figure was back, and this time I could see more detail. He wore a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather, and his outline was sharper, closer, like he had stepped forward between frames. I snapped the camera shut and looked around again, faster this time. The rows of stones stretched in every direction. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but there was no one standing where the image said he should be. My pulse quickened, and the idea of it being a shadow stopped making sense. Shadows don't get closer on their own. It felt less like coincidence and more like some kind of interaction, like the photos were showing me something I wasn't supposed to see with my own eyes. I moved to a different section of the cemetery, partly to prove to myself that this was nothing unusual. I aimed the camera at a small mausoleum, its door sealed shut with rusted hinges, and took a series of shots from different distances. When I looked back at the preview, my breath caught in my throat. He was there again, no longer at a distance but at the edge of the frame, angled slightly toward me. The image gave the impression that he was aware of me, aware of the lens, and waiting for me to notice him. This time I didn't waste energy calling out. I scanned every corner of the cemetery with wide, frantic sweeps, but it was the same empty landscape. It was like the camera had access to something I couldn't see in real time. My hands gripped the equipment tighter than I meant to, and I shoved it all into my bag without caring about scratches or proper storage. The quiet that had once felt artistic now pressed down on me in a way that made my chest ache. I walked quickly to the gate, resisting the urge to run because I didn't want to hear the sound of running footsteps that weren't mine. When I reached the car, I locked the doors before even starting the engine. The drive back to campus blurred together, my eyes darting constantly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to catch the man's coat or his shape tucked into the shadows of the back seat. Of course, there was nothing there. Later that night, I pulled the SD card from my camera and loaded the pictures onto my laptop. I thought maybe I'd convince myself it had been a trick, some stranger wandering that I failed to spot in the moment. But as the images filled the screen, it became impossible to explain away. In each sequence, he moved closer, always toward me, until the last photo where the entire frame was filled with dark fabric and the faint outline of a collar. No face, just the suggestion of him right at the lens. I deleted every file and I never went back to that cemetery. To this day, I don't know if I captured someone real or something I was never supposed to bring back with me. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I spent 12 years as a deputy sheriff in rural Montana before that night, on Highway 287. Most people don't realize how dark and empty those stretches of interstate get after midnight. Miles and miles of nothing but asphalt cutting through grassland, with maybe one car passing every half hour. I was working the graveyard shift that October, just me and my partner covering about 200 miles of highway and the small towns scattered between them. The dispatcher, Nancy, was this 60-something woman who'd been there since the department opened, and she had this way of keeping her voice completely calm no matter what came through those phones. But around 2 a.m. that Friday, even Nancy sounded rattled when she patched through the first call. A trucker heading south had called 911 saying he heard a woman screaming somewhere near mile marker 47. Said it sounded like she was being murdered right there on the shoulder. By the time I got there 15 minutes later, I found his rig pulled over with the engine still rumbling, driver door hanging open, and no sign of him anywhere. The cab still smelled like fresh coffee and cigarettes, and his logbook was open on the passenger seat with an entry half finished. The pen had rolled onto the floor. I called out for him, swept my flashlight across the tall grass on both sides of the road, but there was nothing, just the endless chirping of crickets and the distant hum of power lines. His wallet was still in the center console, $200 in cash untouched, and his cell phone was on the dashboard showing the 911 call still connected. I radioed Nancy to check if the trucker had called back or if another unit had picked him up somewhere, but she said the line just went dead after he'd reported his location. While I was processing the scene, she got another call, this time from a woman in a sedan about 3 miles north, same story. Horrible screaming coming from the roadside, sounded like someone in agony. I told Nancy to keep the woman on the line and floored it up there, but when I arrived 8 minutes later, I found another abandoned vehicle, a silver Toyota with the engine running, purse still on the seat, driver's door wide open to the night. The pattern was too specific to ignore. Both vehicles found with doors open, engines running, personal belongings untouched, and both drivers had called about hearing screams before vanishing. I started documenting everything while waiting for backup, taking photos of the Toyota's interior. Noting that her coffee was still warm in the cup holder, her phone showing a call to her husband at 11:47 p.m., probably letting him know she was on her way home. That's when Nancy's voice crackled through my radio again, and this time she was talking fast, saying she had a teenage girl on the line who was pulled over near mile marker 52, crying and begging for help. The girl kept saying, "He's walking toward my car," over and over. And then Nancy played the audio for me through the radio. I could hear this kid, couldn't have been older than 17, sobbing and saying, "Please don't let him take me. He already took the others. I saw him put them in the..." And then nothing, just the sound of wind and static. Nancy tried calling back but got no response. I was only 4 miles from mile marker 52, so I hit the sirens and pushed my cruiser up to 90, calling for immediate backup from state police and anyone else within 50 miles. The whole time I'm driving, I'm trying to piece together what's happening. 3 people reporting screams, 3 people disappearing within an hour, all along the same 20-mile stretch of highway. When I reached marker 52, I saw the car immediately. A beat-up Honda pulled onto the shoulder with its hazards still blinking. The driver door was open just like the others, but this time I noticed something different. There were drag marks in the gravel leading away from the vehicle, like someone had been pulled across the ground. I followed them with my flashlight for about 30 feet before they just stopped, right at the edge where the shoulder met the grass, as if whoever made them had been lifted up and carried from that point. My backup was still 20 minutes out when I made the decision to search the area on foot, keeping my radio open and updating Nancy every few minutes. The grass along the highway was waist-high in most places, and as I pushed through it with my flashlight, I started noticing these weird indentations in the ground, like paths where something heavy had been dragged repeatedly over time. They all seemed to lead in the same direction, parallel to the highway but about 50 yards from the road itself. That's when I heard it for the first time. A woman's voice, high-pitched and desperate, definitely screaming, but something was wrong about it. The sound was coming from multiple directions at once, echoing in a way that didn't make sense for the open landscape. It would start from my left, then suddenly seem to come from behind me, then from straight ahead, like someone was circling me in the darkness while screaming. But the really disturbing part was that the scream never changed. Same pitch, same duration, same desperation, like a recording being played over and over. I drew my weapon and kept moving toward where the drag paths converged. And that's when I saw the van, a white commercial vehicle with no plates, parked in a shallow ravine that would be completely invisible from the highway. The back doors were open, and I could see what looked like electronic equipment inside. Speakers and amplifiers and some kind of control panel with dozens of switches and red LED lights blinking in sequence. The screaming was definitely coming from those speakers, looping every 45 seconds or so, and I realized this sick bastard had been using recorded screams to lure people off the road. But where were the victims? I called it in to Nancy, gave her the van's description and location, and started checking the surrounding area. About 10 feet from the van, partially hidden under a tarp and branches, I found what looked like a storm cellar door built into the ground, the kind you'd see on old farmsteads, except this was in the middle of nowhere with no structures around for miles. The metal handle on the cellar door was worn smooth from use, and fresh dirt had been scattered around it like someone had opened it recently. I could hear muffled sounds coming from below. Not screaming, but movement. Maybe voices. I radioed my exact coordinates to Nancy and told her to redirect all backup to my location immediately, that I'd found something underground and needed the tactical team. She said the state police were still 12 minutes away, and I had to make a choice: wait for backup and risk losing whoever was down there, or go in alone. The sounds from below were getting more urgent, like someone banging on metal. And I kept thinking about that teenage girl who'd called 40 minutes ago, begging not to be taken. I positioned myself to the side of the door, yanked it open, and immediately the smell hit me. Dampness mixed with motor oil and something else, something chemical like chloroform or ether. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, and I could see light flickering at the bottom, shadows moving across the walls. I announced myself as law enforcement and started down those stairs, each step echoing in what sounded like a much larger space than I expected. At the bottom, the cellar opened into a room about the size of a double garage, lit by a single work light hanging from the ceiling. Against the far wall, I saw them. 5 people sitting on the floor with their hands zip-tied behind their backs and duct tape over their mouths, including the teenage girl from the Honda and the truck driver from the first call. They were all awake, eyes wide with terror, frantically nodding toward the corner of the room I couldn't see from my position. I swept my gun in that direction and saw him, a man in his 40s, average height, wearing stained coveralls and holding a syringe in one hand. He had this perfectly calm expression, like he'd been expecting me, and behind him was a tunnel entrance carved into the dirt wall, probably leading to another exit somewhere. He didn't run or attack, just set the syringe down carefully on a metal table, covered with more zip ties, rolls of tape, and bottles of what looked like sedatives. "You're earlier than I expected," he said, his voice completely casual, like we were discussing the weather. "Usually takes at least 2 hours before anyone checks the vehicles properly. Small-town departments, you understand." He took a step backward toward the tunnel, keeping his hands visible but moving with practiced confidence. And that's when I noticed the timer on the table, a digital display counting down from 3 minutes and 14 seconds. "That's connected to the ventilation system," he explained, gesturing with his chin toward some PVC pipes running along the ceiling. "When it hits 0, this room fills with carbon monoxide from a generator I've got running about 100 feet through that tunnel. You can try to get them all out, or you can come after me, but you definitely can't do both." The victims started making muffled screaming sounds through their gags, thrashing against their restraints, and I could see the pure panic in their eyes as they understood what he was saying. He backed into the tunnel entrance and added, Oh, and cutting their zip ties takes about 30 seconds per person if you're careful not to slice their wrists. Math's not in your favor, deputy. He disappeared into the tunnel, and I had to make the fastest decision of my career. I ran to the victims, pulling out my knife and starting with the teenage girl since she was closest. The zip ties were the heavy-duty kind, multiple loops around each wrist, and he was right. It took me nearly 40 seconds to free her hands without cutting her. She immediately ripped the tape off her mouth and started sobbing that there were others, that he'd been taking people for weeks and moving them through the tunnels to different locations. 2 minutes left on the timer. I managed to cut the trucker free and handed him my knife, telling him to free the others while I tried to find the ventilation controls. The PVC pipes all led to a junction box near the stairs, but it was welded shut, no way to access it quickly. The girl was helping tear tape off the others' mouths, and one of them, a woman in business clothes, gasped out that she'd seen him reset the timer earlier. The code was pound 473 pound on the keypad next to the display. 45 seconds left. I punched in the code while the trucker was still cutting the last person free, and the timer stopped at 32 seconds, the red digits frozen but still glowing in that dim light. The relief lasted maybe 2 seconds before we heard the rumbling from the tunnel. He was collapsing it from the other side, and dust started pouring into the room. We scrambled up those stairs so fast that the teenage girl tripped, and I had to carry her the rest of the way, everyone coughing and choking on the dirt filling the air. When we burst out into the night, my backup was just arriving. 3 state police cars and 2 ambulances screaming down from the highway. I pointed half of them toward where I estimated the tunnel would exit, probably another ravine or hidden spot, while the EMTs started checking the victims. The girl grabbed my arm and told me there was something else I needed to know. She'd heard him on a radio earlier talking to someone he called Dispatch, giving updates on the collections, which meant he wasn't working alone. Within 3 hours, we had 40 officers combing every inch of that highway corridor, and they found 2 more underground chambers, both empty but recently used, with the same setup of restraints and sedatives. The tunnel system connected all 3 sites, roughly 2 miles of hand-dug passages that must have taken years to complete. We never caught him that night. He had ATVs stashed at 2 exit points, and by the time our helicopters arrived, he'd vanished into the wilderness. But here's what still haunts me. When the FBI tech team analyzed the audio equipment in his van, they found over 200 different recorded screams, each one labeled with a date and location going back 8 years across 6 different states. The investigation revealed he was part of a network, guys who called themselves collectors, who would grab people off remote highways and trade them like inventory. We rescued 17 more victims over the next month following leads from that night, but he personally was never found. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night and I hear a strange sound off the highway, I wonder if he's out there somewhere, setting up another trap, playing another recorded scream to lure someone into the darkness. "7 months have passed since that night on Willow Street, and I still can't drive past that neighborhood without feeling my chest tighten. I'm Officer Emily Carter, been with the suburban police force for about 8 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything our quiet town could throw at me. Domestic calls were routine for me. I'd handled dozens, maybe hundreds. Most were verbal disputes that needed cooling down. Some required arrests, but they all followed a predictable pattern. That Wednesday night in early March started like any other swing shift. I was parked near the shopping center, finishing paperwork from a minor theft report, when dispatch crackled through about a disturbance at 4782 Willow Street. The neighbors, an elderly couple named the Johnsons, had called about violent arguing, and what sounded like furniture being thrown around next door. The drive to Willow Street took maybe 6 minutes, and I remember thinking how peaceful everything looked under the streetlights. It was one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions built in the late 90s, all 2-story colonials with attached garages and perfectly manicured lawns. Number 4782 stood out immediately, though. Every light in the house was blazing, even the porch lights and what looked like basement windows. But there was no movement visible through any of the windows, no shadows passing by, nothing. The silence hit me as soon as I stepped out of my patrol car. After a reported violent argument, you expect to hear something. Continued shouting, crying. Maybe the TV turned up loud to cover the awkwardness. But this house was dead quiet, and all those lights burning made it feel like the place was holding its breath, waiting for something. I radioed my position to dispatch and approached the front door, noting the pristine welcome mat that read, "Bless this home," in cursive letters. The door was slightly ajar, maybe 3 inches open, and through the gap I could see into the foyer. A ceramic vase lay shattered across the hardwood floor, dirt and wilted daisies scattered among the pieces. I announced myself loudly, "Police, is anyone home? I'm coming in to check on your welfare," and pushed the door open wider with my shoulder. The smell hit me immediately. Copper and bleach mixing together in a way that made my sinuses burn. In my 8 years on the force, I'd learned that smell meant someone had tried to clean up blood. And recently, the living room to my right looked like a tornado had torn through it. The coffee table was flipped, its glass top spider-webbed with cracks, and the beige couch had been shoved hard against the wall, leaving deep scratches across the floor. Dark red droplets led from the living room toward the kitchen, getting thicker and more frequent as I followed them. In the kitchen, I found a pool of blood near the island counter, maybe 8 inches across, still tacky but not fresh, probably 2 or 3 hours old based on the consistency. Cabinet doors hung open, dishes scattered on the counters like someone had been searching frantically for something. But what really made me draw my weapon was the basement door. It had been padlocked from the outside with a heavy-duty master lock, the kind you'd use on a storage unit. But someone had taken a hammer to it. The tool was still lying on the floor, and the lock hung twisted and broken from the hasp. Fresh scratches covered the door frame around the lock, deep gouges in the white paint that showed raw wood underneath. Whoever had been trying to get through that door had been desperate, working at it from multiple angles until they'd finally succeeded. I called for backup before descending those stairs, told dispatch I had signs of violence and needed another unit immediately. The basement stairs creaked under my weight, and that chemical bleach smell grew stronger with each step down. What I found at the bottom made me stop breathing for a moment. The basement had been converted into some kind of living space, but not the cozy rec room kind you'd expect in suburbia. A stained mattress sat in the corner on the concrete floor, still bearing the indent of a body. Next to it, a bucket that I didn't want to examine too closely, and a pile of women's clothing folded neatly on a plastic chair. But the worst part was the wall. Someone had drilled industrial-grade eye bolts into the concrete, 4 of them at different heights, with heavy chains still attached. The chains had blood on the cuffs, along with what looked like pieces of skin where someone had struggled against them for a long time. On a workbench against the far wall, I found what made this whole scene click into place. There were 3 driver's licenses, all different women, all from different states, Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan. Next to them sat a notebook filled with schedules, times, and observations written in neat handwriting. Subject 3, refuses meals days 1 to 3. Subject 2, attempted communication with Subject 3, separated immediately. New acquisition planned for next week. Blonde, early 20s, spotted at campus library. My radio crackled with backup arriving, but I was already photographing everything with my phone, knowing how crucial every detail would be. The most recent entry was from that morning. Subject 3 broke during night. Unusual strength display, may need to terminate ahead of schedule. Below that, in different handwriting, shaky, barely legible, someone had written, "He's upstairs, get out now." The floorboards above me creaked and every muscle in my body went rigid. I hadn't cleared the second floor. In my rush to follow the blood trail and investigate the basement, I'd violated basic protocol. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving from what sounded like directly above toward the stairs. My backup was outside, probably just entering the house, but they didn't know someone was still here. I keyed my radio as quietly as possible. Suspect still in house, second floor, approach with extreme caution. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard running, heavy boots pounding across the floor above, heading toward the back of the house. I bolted up the basement stairs, taking them two at a time, just as I heard glass shatter somewhere upstairs. By the time I reached the second floor with two other officers behind me, we found a bedroom window completely smashed out, curtains billowing in the night air. The bedroom told another part of the story. Men's clothes filled the closet, all organized by color, and the dresser held a collection of watches, rings, and wallets. Trophies, I realized, from victims' boyfriends or husbands. On the nightstand sat a police scanner, still turned on, and a laptop that was open to a University of Michigan student directory. But the detail that haunts me most was the wall behind the bed. He'd covered it with printed photos from social media, dozens of young women at coffee shops, libraries, grocery stores, all taken from a distance, all unaware they were being photographed. Each photo had notes written in red marker. Too public, lives with roommates, perfect, isolated jogging route, parents visit monthly, no. Some photos had large X's drawn through them, and checking later, we found those women matched missing persons reports from surrounding counties. The one marked Subject 4, next week, showed a young brunette studying at a Starbucks, her car keys visible on the table with a distinctive pom-pom keychain. We set up a perimeter immediately, K9 units tracking from the broken window, but the bastard had planned even his escape route. He'd left a rope ladder attached to the window frame, leading down to a shed roof, then to a fence that backed up to a wooded area behind the subdivision. The dogs lost his scent at a creek about a quarter-mile in, where we found tire tracks from what looked like an ATV he'd stashed there. Inside the shed, we discovered he'd been preparing for this possibility. There were bags of clothes, cash in various currencies, hair dye, and 3 different sets of fake IDs with his photo but different names. Robert Brennan, James Whitfield, Christopher Vaughn. We had no idea which, if any, was his real name. What we did know was that he'd been operating for at least 18 months based on the earliest dated photos, and the 3 women whose IDs we found were just the most recent victims. The forensics team worked through the night, and by morning we'd identified the blood in the kitchen as belonging to Melissa Harding, the woman from Illinois whose license we'd found. The other 2 women were Ashley Novak from Ohio and Jennifer Tam from Michigan. Here's what we pieced together. One of them, probably Melissa based on the blood volume and the desperate message, had somehow gotten free while he was out. She'd broken the basement door lock from the inside. We found her blood on the hammer handle and tried to help the others escape, but he came home before they could all get out. The neighbors heard the struggle as he tried to regain control, furniture crashing as Melissa fought back with a desperation that gave her that unusual strength he'd noted. She'd wounded him too. We found his blood mixed with hers on a kitchen knife left in the sink. The other 2 women had gotten out during the chaos, we learned later, running barely clothed through backyards until they reached a house 6 blocks away where they pounded on doors until someone let them in and called 911. But Melissa never made it out. We found her body 2 days later, buried in fresh concrete in the garage of another house he'd been renting under one of his fake names, 3 towns over. The coroner said she'd fought until the very end. Defensive wounds covering her arms, his DNA under her fingernails. She'd saved 2 lives with her courage, creating enough chaos for Ashley and Jennifer to escape while she held him off. The house on Willow Street turned out to be just one of 3 properties he was using. The second was that garage where we found Melissa, and the third was a cabin up near the state forest where he'd been taking his victims initially before moving them to the suburban basement. Each location showed the same meticulous planning, the same horrible attention to detail. We found journals dating back 3 years, documenting his research and methods, how he'd studied police response times, neighborhood patterns, and even attended community meetings to blend in as a concerned resident. Ashley and Jennifer spent weeks in the hospital recovering, both physically and mentally, from their ordeal. They testified before a grand jury, and their descriptions finally gave us a real profile of him. Mid-30s, around 6 feet tall, brown hair always kept short and neat, spoke with a slight southern accent he tried to hide. He knew law enforcement procedures, possibly former military or police himself based on his methods. The FBI took over the case after we found evidence suggesting he'd operated in at least 4 other states before settling here. They're still hunting him, sending updates occasionally, following sightings that never pan out. Sometimes I drive past that house on Willow Street. It's been sold now, renovated completely. A young family lives there with no idea what happened in their basement. But I know. Ashley and Jennifer know, and somewhere out there he knows too. Probably watching another coffee shop, taking more photos, making more lists. That's what keeps me up at night. Not what I found in that house, but knowing he's still out there, planning to do it all over again. Colorado nights in September get cold fast, and that Friday the temperature had already dropped to near freezing by the time I clocked in for my shift at the 911 dispatch center. 8 years I'd been answering emergency calls in our small mountain town, and the job had become part of my DNA. The weight of the headset, the glow of multiple monitors, the constant awareness that someone's worst moment might come through my line at any second. The dispatch center sat in the basement of the police station. No windows, just fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead and made everything feel disconnected from the outside world. My coffee had gone cold within minutes, but I didn't care. Friday nights usually kept us busy enough that I'd forget about it anyway. 2 other dispatchers worked alongside me that evening, Carol at the far end dealing with fire and medical, and Kevin handling highway patrol. The clock on the wall showed 10:45 p.m. when I stretched in my chair, rolled my shoulders, and reached for that cold coffee. In exactly 2 minutes, a call would come through that would fundamentally change how I understood fear, how I processed danger, and why I eventually walked away from a job I once loved. The red light blinked on my console at 10:47 p.m., and when I answered, I heard breathing first, rapid, shallow, like someone trying not to hyperventilate. Then came the whisper, so quiet my brain took a second to process actual words. "Someone's in my house." The caller identified himself as Gregory Walsh, address 1847 Pine Ridge Drive, and every word came out strained, barely voiced, as if speaking any louder would bring death to his door. Through his phone I could hear the distinct creak of floorboards somewhere distant, the kind of sound old houses make when someone's walking slowly, carefully, trying not to be heard themselves. Gregory explained he was locked in his upstairs bathroom, sitting in the bathtub with the shower curtain pulled closed, phone pressed to his ear so hard I could hear his pulse through the connection. His wife Catherine and 16-year-old daughter Megan were supposed to be in their bedrooms, but he hadn't heard from them since the sound of breaking glass had woken him 5 minutes earlier. I typed rapid notes while keeping my voice professional and calm, dispatching units immediately. But then Gregory's breathing hitched and he whispered something that sent ice through my veins. "They're not taking anything. I can hear them opening doors, checking rooms. They're looking for us." My training kicked in automatically while my mind raced with the implications of what he'd just said. I informed Gregory that Officer Daniel Ruiz and his partner were less than 4 minutes away, already speeding down the mountain roads with lights off to avoid alerting the intruders. Pine Ridge Drive was one of those isolated residential streets on the town's outskirts, where houses sat on multi-acre lots, separated by thick stands of pine trees that blocked sound and sight from neighbors. I pulled up the house details on my screen. A 2-story colonial built in 1987. Previous calls to the address showed nothing unusual, just a medical emergency 3 years prior when Catherine had fallen off a ladder. Gregory's whispers became more urgent as he reported hearing footsteps on the stairs now, slow and methodical, each step deliberate, as if the intruder knew exactly where they were going. He started giving me descriptions between terrified breaths, at least 2 sets of footsteps, heavy boots, no voices, just this terrible purposeful movement through his home. Then he heard something that made him stop mid-sentence. His daughter's bedroom door opening down the hall, the distinctive squeak it made that he'd been meaning to oil for months. The line went silent except for Gregory's breathing, and I found myself holding my own breath, waiting. After what felt like hours but was probably 10 seconds, he whispered that he could hear muffled voices now, low and steady, coming from Megan's room. Not screaming, not crying, just talking in tones too quiet to make out words. He wanted to leave the bathroom, wanted to get to his family, but I kept him on the line, reminding him that officers were now just 2 minutes away, that his best chance to help his family was to stay hidden and keep feeding me information. That's when things took an even stranger turn. Gregory suddenly said the voices had stopped, and he heard footsteps going back downstairs, multiple sets, moving quickly now but still controlled. Through the phone, I heard what sounded like a door closing somewhere in the house, then nothing but the settling sounds houses make at night. Gregory waited another 30 seconds before carefully opening the bathroom door, and I stayed with him as he crept down the hallway toward his daughter's room. He pushed open her door, and I heard him make a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a scream, more like all the air leaving his body at once. The room was empty, bed still made, window closed and locked from the inside, no sign of Megan anywhere. Gregory's panic escalated as he ran to the master bedroom, calling out for Catherine, his whispers abandoned now in desperate shouts of his wife's name. Through the phone, I heard him throwing open the door, then that same devastating silence. Catherine was gone too. Her reading glasses sat on the nightstand next to an open book, pages still pressed flat like she just set it down for a moment. The bathroom they shared showed her face cream jar open on the counter, a cotton pad beside it with makeup remover. Half her nightly routine interrupted. Gregory kept saying it was impossible, that no one could have carried 2 people out without him hearing something more, that the house only had 2 exits and he would have heard them using the stairs. I tried to keep him focused while typing urgent updates for the responding units, now just 1 minute out. He stumbled through the hallway, checking the guest room, the office, even the linen closet, each space empty but showing those small signs of recent life. A coffee mug here, a phone charger there, a sweater draped over a chair. The house felt lived in but abandoned, like everyone had simply evaporated mid-routine. Officer Ruiz's voice crackled through my radio at 10:52 p.m., reporting they were pulling up to the residence. And that's when Gregory said something that made everyone in the dispatch center turn toward my station. "Wait," he breathed into the phone. "I can see the police car from the window, but the kitchen door downstairs is opening again. Someone's coming back in." I immediately relayed this to Ruiz, who confirmed they were still in their vehicle, observing the house, seeing no movement outside. Gregory's breathing became erratic as he described hearing those same heavy footsteps entering through the kitchen, moving with purpose toward the staircase. But Ruiz was adamant. They had clear sight lines to all entrance points. Nobody was entering or leaving that house. I had Gregory on one line describing intruders inside, and Ruiz on the radio swearing the house was sealed tight. No signs of forced entry, no movement visible through any windows. The footsteps Gregory heard were getting closer, he said, coming up the stairs again but faster this time, not trying to be quiet anymore. Ruiz and his partner drew their weapons and approached the front door, announcing themselves loudly. And that's when Gregory's line did something that still doesn't make sense. It didn't disconnect, didn't cut off, but his voice just stopped mid-word, leaving only the faint sound of breathing that wasn't quite his. The breathing on Gregory's line continued, steady and rhythmic, but wrong somehow. Too measured, too calm for someone who'd just been terrified. I kept calling his name, asking him to respond, while Ruiz reported they were forcing entry through the front door. The sound of splintering wood came through both the radio and, eerily, a half-second delayed, through Gregory's still-open phone line. Ruiz and his partner swept through the first floor, their tactical movements echoing through Gregory's phone, creating this disorienting double audio that made my head spin. They found the kitchen door locked from the inside, deadbolt engaged. No signs of forced entry anywhere. The dinner table still had 3 plates set out with half-eaten spaghetti, forks resting on the edges like the family had just stepped away for a moment. Steam was actually still rising from a cup of tea on the counter. Ruiz called out for the family, announced themselves as police, but the house gave back nothing but their own voices. I kept Gregory's line open, that breathing still there, unchanging. And I noticed Carol and Kevin had both moved closer to my station, listening with expressions I'd never seen on their faces before. Ruiz reported moving to the 2nd floor, and through Gregory's phone, I heard their boots on the stairs seconds before Ruiz's radio transmission confirmed it. They found the master bedroom exactly as Gregory had described. Catherine's book open, her glasses waiting, that half-finished nighttime routine frozen in time. Megan's room showed similar suspension of normal life. Homework spread across her desk, pencil lying across an unfinished math problem, her laptop still warm and logged into a social media page where a half-typed message sat in a chat box. Mom's calling me for din. The bathroom where Gregory had hidden was empty, bathtub dry. No sign anyone had been there recently. But here's what made me request a different assignment the next day. Ruiz found Gregory's phone in the kitchen, lying on the counter next to that steaming cup of tea. The call duration showed 11 minutes and 34 seconds, still active, still connected to my line. When Ruiz picked it up and spoke into it, I heard his voice clearly through my headset. But that breathing continued underneath it, as if coming from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that wasn't that kitchen, wasn't that house, maybe wasn't anywhere a person should be able to call from. The investigation that followed turned up details that only made things worse. The Walsh family's car was in the driveway, keys hanging on the hook by the door, wallets and phones all accounted for except for how they could have left. Security footage from the only gas station on Pine Ridge Drive, about a quarter-mile away, showed nothing. No vehicles passing during the time frame, no people walking by. Absolutely no movement except for a single deer around 10:30 p.m. The technical team analyzed the 911 call and confirmed it originated from the house's landline. But here's where it gets impossible to explain. The landline had been disconnected 2 years ago when the family switched to cell phones only. The physical phone was found in a box in the basement, covered in dust, no battery backup, no connection to any working line. Phone company records showed no activity on that number since 2022, yet somehow I had an 11-minute conversation with someone claiming to be Gregory Walsh, describing his house in perfect detail, down to the squeaky door and his wife's reading glasses. What haunts me even more than the impossibility of it all is what we found 3 days later when Ruiz went back to do another sweep. Hidden in the basement ceiling above a loose tile that looked recently disturbed, they discovered 3 cell phones, not the family's phones, which were still on the kitchen counter, but older models, the kind people keep as backups. Each phone had a single video file, time-stamped from that Friday night. I wasn't supposed to see these videos, but Ruiz showed them to me anyway, maybe hoping I could make sense of what I'd heard. The first showed the house from outside, someone filming through the kitchen window as the family ate dinner, unaware. The second was taken from inside Megan's room while she did homework, filmed from her closet through the slightly open door. The third video was the worst. It showed the upstairs bathroom, filmed from inside the bathroom, behind the shower curtain, recording an empty tub at 10:47 p.m., exactly when Gregory claimed to be hiding there. The videos ended simultaneously at 10:58 p.m., the exact moment Gregory's voice had cut out on my line, each cutting to black with the same sound, that measured wrong breathing I'd heard continue on the call. The FBI took over the case within a week, and suddenly everyone involved was signing NDAs and being told to forget what we'd seen and heard. But before they locked everything down, Ruiz discovered one more piece of evidence that explained nothing, but suggested something far worse than a simple kidnapping. In the basement wall, behind the water heater, investigators found a crawl space that shouldn't have existed according to the house's original blueprints. Inside were sleeping bags, water bottles, protein bar wrappers and notebooks filled with the family's daily routines, documented for months, when they ate, when they slept, which lights they turned on in which order, even notes about their breathing patterns at night. But the handwriting in those notebooks matched Gregory Walsh's own handwriting perfectly, confirmed by comparison with documents from his home office. The dates in the notebooks went back 6 months, but Gregory's co-workers swore he'd been at work every single day. Security footage confirmed it, and his family had never mentioned him acting strange. The space looked lived in, used recently, but the dust pattern suggested no one had entered it in weeks. The FBI consultant brought in to analyze the scene said something I'll never forget. Either this family was stalking themselves, or someone wanted us to think they were. I quit the dispatch job 2 months after that night. Couldn't handle hearing voices through the headset anymore without wondering where they really were, who they really were. The Walsh family was never found, despite nationwide searches and their faces on every missing persons database. The house on Pine Ridge Drive stood empty for exactly 1 year before burning down in what investigators called an electrical fire, though no cause was ever definitively determined. Sometimes I drive by the empty lot where the house used to be, and I swear I can still feel something wrong about that spot, like the air itself remembers what happened. Ruiz transferred to a different state, said he couldn't work any case without thinking about those videos, about that breathing. The official report, what little of it wasn't classified, concluded the family left voluntarily, though it couldn't explain how or why or where they went. But I know what I heard that night. Real terror in Gregory's voice, real footsteps in that house, and then that breathing that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The truth is, some cases don't get solved because there's no solution that makes sense in the world we think we understand. And the Walsh family disappearance is one of them. All I know for certain is that somewhere, maybe not in a place we can point to on a map, Gregory Walsh made a phone call that couldn't have happened, describing events that both did and didn't occur, and then vanished along with his family into whatever space exists between possible and impossible. I need everyone here to understand that what I'm about to share isn't some creepypasta or urban legend. This actually happened to me and 12 other families in our neighborhood last summer. I'm a 34-year-old accountant, married with 2 kids, and we'd been living in our house in a quiet subdivision outside Phoenix for about 6 years when everything went to hell. Life was pretty standard suburban stuff. Barbecues on weekends, kids playing in the cul-de-sac, everyone keeping their lawns perfect for the HOA. I worked from home most days. My wife Lauren taught at the local elementary school, and our biggest concern was whether our son made the Little League team. That all changed on a Wednesday morning in late July when I woke up on my living room floor with the worst headache of my life and absolutely no memory of how I got there. The first thing I noticed, besides the splitting pain behind my eyes, was that my mouth tasted like I'd been sucking on pennies all night. Lauren was passed out on the couch, still in her pajamas, and our kids, 8-year-old Jason and 6-year-old Mia, were sprawled on the carpet near the TV, which was still playing some cartoon on low volume. The digital clock on the cable box showed 11:47 a.m., which made 0 sense because my internal alarm always woke me at 6:30, even on weekends. I tried to sit up and the room spun so violently I had to grab the coffee table to keep from falling over. That's when I saw our front door was wide open, morning sunlight streaming in, and muddy footprints tracked across our hardwood floor leading straight to our bedroom. I crawled over to Lauren and shook her shoulder, fighting waves of nausea with every movement. She groaned and her eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, pupils dilated like she'd just come from the eye doctor. "What? Why am I?" she mumbled. Then her maternal instincts kicked in and she jolted upright, immediately regretting it as she clutched her head. We both scrambled to the kids, checking pulses, breathing, making sure they were okay. Jason stirred when I touched his forehead, muttering something about purple elephants, which would have been funny if I wasn't absolutely terrified. While Lauren stayed with them, I forced myself to stand and follow those muddy prints, using the wall for support. They went through our bedroom, into our walk-in closet, and stopped right at the small safe where we kept important documents, some cash, and Lauren's grandmother's jewelry. The safe door hung open, completely empty. The next hour was a blur of confusion and growing panic. I called 911 while Lauren got the kids to slowly wake up, giving them water and checking them over. The dispatcher kept asking if we needed an ambulance, and honestly, I didn't know. We were all conscious and breathing, but something was clearly, horribly wrong with us. 2 police cars showed up within 10 minutes, followed by an ambulance and, weirdly, a hazmat team. Officer Reeves, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a notebook already out, started asking questions while the EMTs checked our vitals. My blood pressure was through the roof. The kids were groggy but responsive, and Lauren kept forgetting words mid-sentence, which scared me more than anything else. But what really made my gut clench was when Officer Reeves asked if we'd checked on our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, because they'd gotten 3 similar calls from our street in the last 20 minutes. The hazmat team went straight to work with these handheld devices, sweeping them around our doors and windows like they were looking for something specific. One of them, a younger guy whose badge said Flores, suddenly called his supervisor over when his device started beeping near our mail slot. They had a quick, hushed conversation. Then Flores came over with this serious expression and asked if we'd noticed any unusual smells last night, maybe something sweet or chemical-like. Lauren and I exchanged confused looks. We'd gone to bed around 10 p.m. after watching the news, and everything had been completely normal. That's when the real horror hit me. We had absolutely no memory of anything between going to bed and waking up on the living room floor. Not a dream, not getting up to use the bathroom, nothing. Just a complete black void where 8 hours of our lives should have been. They evacuated our entire street, 13 houses in total. The Nguyens from 2 doors down were missing their new laptops and a watch collection. The Andersons across the street had their entire home office cleaned out, and poor Mrs. Patterson. They found her unconscious in her hallway, severely dehydrated. The ambulance rushed her to the hospital, and I later heard she spent 3 days in the ICU. The police set up a command center in the community center parking lot, and one by one they interviewed each family. The stories were eerily similar. Everyone went to bed normally, woke up late and disoriented in weird places, found their homes ransacked with surgical precision. The thieves had taken only specific valuable items, electronics, jewelry, cash, but had left TVs mounted on walls, had ignored cars in garages, hadn't touched credit cards sitting on counters. Detective Briggs, who'd been called in from the city, said it was the most organized burglary ring he'd seen in 20 years of police work. The test results came back that afternoon, and Detective Briggs gathered all the families in the community center to explain what had happened to us. They'd found traces of sevoflurane, a medical-grade anesthetic gas, around our mail slots, bathroom vents, and even in some cases through gaps under doors. Someone had literally gassed our entire street like we were patients going under for surgery. The detective explained that the thieves had probably used a modified pump system, maybe something disguised as maintenance equipment, to flood our homes with enough gas to keep us unconscious for hours. The dose had been carefully calculated, enough to knock us out completely but not enough to kill us, though Mrs. Patterson came dangerously close due to her age and health conditions. What made me want to vomit was when he said they'd found evidence suggesting the crew had been inside our homes for at least 2 to 3 hours, walking around us, stepping over our unconscious bodies, going through our personal belongings while we lay there completely helpless. Lauren couldn't stop crying after that meeting, and honestly, neither could half the neighborhood. The violation went beyond just stolen property. These people had been in our homes, had seen us at our most vulnerable, had moved us around like furniture to get us out of their way. The Nguyens' teenage daughter, Sophia, had been found in the bathtub fully clothed, and she had no memory of walking there. The Andersons discovered their 2-year-old had been taken from his crib and placed on their bed, surrounded by pillows. My own son Jason had apparently been moved from his top bunk to the floor because they needed to search his desk underneath. The forensics team found latex glove prints everywhere, boot prints from at least 4 different people, and traces of the gas lingering in our carpet and furniture fabric. They told us to wash everything, air out our houses for at least 48 hours, and see our doctors for blood work to make sure there were no lasting effects from the anesthetic. But here's where things got even darker. 5 days after our street was hit, Detective Briggs called me personally. They'd found similar cases in 2 other subdivisions in the area, one from 3 weeks before us, another from 6 weeks back. Same MO, same type of gas, same selective theft pattern. But in the most recent case, in a neighborhood called Desert Springs about 15 miles from us, something had gone wrong. A family of 5, the Walkers, hadn't woken up when they should have. The father was diabetic, the mother had sleep apnea, and the combination of their medical conditions with the gas had put them both in comas. Their 3 kids, ages 5, 9, and 11, were found conscious but severely disoriented, unable to wake their parents, trapped in the house for almost 14 hours before a concerned coworker called for a welfare check. Mr. Walker died 2 days later from complications, and Mrs. Walker was still on a ventilator when Briggs called me. The police started connecting dots they hadn't seen before. 3 families from the earlier robberies had reported strange things in the days before the break-ins. A van from a fake pest control company asking to inspect for termites. A woman claiming to be from the water department checking meters. 2 men in hard hats examining telephone poles and taking photos of houses. The Andersons remembered a guy had knocked on their door 3 days before the robbery, claiming he was updating maps for a delivery service, and asking weird questions about how many people lived there and what time everyone usually went to bed. Lauren suddenly remembered finding our mail slot slightly bent 2 weeks before the incident, like someone had tried to measure it or test something. We'd thought nothing of it at the time. The police theorized the crew had been casing neighborhoods for weeks, maybe months, learning routines, identifying targets, calculating exactly how much gas they'd need for each house based on square footage and number of occupants. Then came the breakthrough nobody expected. 2 weeks after our robbery, the Nguyen's daughter Sophia was scrolling through her Instagram when she started screaming. She'd found a photo posted by someone she didn't recognize, taken inside their living room while they were all unconscious. The photo showed her father slumped in his recliner with a timestamp of 2:47 a.m. on the night of the robbery. The account belonged to someone using the name Night Shift Crew 702, and when the police traced it, they found dozens of similar photos. Families passed out in their homes across 3 states, spanning 8 months. The sick bastards had been documenting their crimes like trophies. The FBI got involved immediately, tracking the account through various IP addresses to a rental house in Nevada. When they raided it, they found the pumping equipment, tanks of sevoflurane stolen from a medical supply company, detailed maps of neighborhoods with houses marked in different colors based on vulnerability, and notebooks full of surveillance notes about hundreds of families, including which kids had which bedrooms and what time everyone's lights typically went out. The arrests made national news. 4 people were charged initially, 2 brothers named Garrett and Shane Hoffman, who had worked as HVAC technicians and knew exactly how to exploit home ventilation systems. Their cousin Diana Ross, who had nursing training and calculated the gas dosages, and her boyfriend, Paul Kramer, who'd worked in hospital equipment maintenance and had stolen the anesthetic supplies over a period of 2 years. But during interrogation, Diana broke down and revealed something that still makes me sick to think about. They hadn't just been robbing houses, they'd been selling access. For the right price, they'd gas a specific house and let someone else come in to do whatever they wanted while the family was unconscious. 3 cases were identified, where nothing was stolen, but evidence suggested someone had been in the homes for hours. One family had found their teenage daughter's room disturbed in ways that I can't even write about it. The FBI expanded the investigation, ultimately arresting 11 more people across 4 states who had paid for this service. The trial lasted 3 months. Garrett Hoffman got life without parole after they linked him to Mr. Walker's death and the conspiracy charges. Shane got 40 years, Diana got 35 after cooperating with prosecutors, and Paul got 28 years. The others who'd paid for access got sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years, depending on what they'd done in those houses. Our family testified, along with 43 other victim families. Seeing those people in orange jumpsuits, hearing Diana describe in clinical detail how she'd calculated doses to keep children unconscious without killing them, watching the prosecutor show those Instagram photos of unconscious families like they were vacation snapshots. It was surreal and nauseating. The judge called it one of the most disturbing cases of organized crime he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. The medical supply company that had failed to notice 2 years of missing sevoflurane faced massive lawsuits and criminal negligence charges. New federal laws were passed requiring stricter monitoring of anesthetic substances and mandatory reporting of any theft within 24 hours. We moved 6 months later. Couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't sleep in that house knowing strangers had walked through it while we lay there helpless. Couldn't walk past the mail slot without remembering. Couldn't look at our neighbors without seeing their own haunted expressions. We installed a fortress of security in our new place. Cameras, motion sensors, reinforced doors, sealed mail slots, everything. Lauren still checks on the kids 3 or 4 times every night. Jason won't sleep on the top bunk anymore. Says it makes him feel too exposed. Mia, who doesn't really remember that night, just knows that Mommy and Daddy get scared sometimes and need extra hugs. The insurance covered our stolen items, but some things can't be replaced. Lauren's grandmother's jewelry had been in her family for generations, and more importantly, our sense of safety is just gone. I still wake up some mornings in a panic checking the time, making sure I can remember going to bed, terrified that I'll taste pennies in my mouth. The therapist says it's PTSD, that it'll get better with time. Maybe she's right. But every time I hear about a strange van in someone's neighborhood or see a utility worker I don't recognize, I call the police. Every single time. Because now I know that monsters don't need to hide under beds or in closets. Sometimes they just need a pump, some stolen medical supplies, and a floor plan. "10 years wearing a badge teaches you to expect the unexpected, but nothing in my training prepared me for what happened on Route 49 last August. I was Officer Michael Grant with the state police, working the graveyard shift out of a small station that covered about 300 miles of rural highways. Most nights were quiet, drunk drivers, speeding tickets, the occasional deer collision. I actually preferred those long, empty stretches of asphalt at 2 a.m., just me and my cruiser, and the radio crackling with distant chatter from other units. My wife Amy always worried about me working alone out there, especially after our daughter Chloe was born, but I'd tell her the isolation was actually safer than city patrol. Fewer people meant fewer problems, or at least that's what I believed until that night when dispatch called about the silver sedan. The call came in around 2:47 a.m., and I remember the exact time because I'd just finished my 3rd cup of coffee and was noting it in my log when dispatch broke through the static. "Unit 7-4, we've got a situation. Multiple 911 hang-ups from a cell phone. GPS shows it's moving northbound on Route 49 near mile marker 82. That put it about 15 minutes from my position. The dispatcher, Betty, sounded different than usual. There was an edge to her voice I'd never heard before. She'd been working dispatch for 20 years and nothing rattled her, but something about these calls had her spooked. "Michael, the caller hasn't said a word in any of the calls, but the line stays open for exactly 17 seconds each time before disconnecting. We've had 6 calls in the past 40 minutes, all from the same number registered to a 2018 silver Toyota Camry, plate number Whiskey Tango 4379. I flipped on my lights and headed north, pushing my Crown Vic up to 90 on the empty highway while Betty fed me updates. I spotted the Camry about 12 minutes later, doing exactly 55 in the right lane like it was on cruise control. Nothing unusual about the driving pattern, No swerving, no speed changes, just steady as a metronome. I ran the plates to confirm, and sure enough, it matched Betty's information. The registered owner was listed as Harold Simmons, 67 years old. Address in Brookfield, about 2 hours away. No priors, no warrants, just a retired electrician with a clean record. I called it in and told Betty I was initiating a traffic stop, then hit my sirens for a quick burst to get the driver's attention. The Camry immediately began slowing down and pulling onto the shoulder. Textbook perfect, like whoever was driving had done this before. The whole thing felt routine, except for this weird pressure in my chest, like the air had gotten heavier somehow. Even with my windows up and AC running, I could feel the humid August night pressing against the glass. The Camry came to a complete stop about 50 feet ahead of my position, engine still running, brake lights glowing red in the darkness. I positioned my cruiser at the standard offset angle, keeping my spotlight trained on the rear window while I radioed my location to dispatch. Through the back glass, I couldn't make out anyone in the driver's seat. The angle and the tinted windows made it impossible to see clearly. I waited the usual 30 seconds, watching for movement, checking my mirrors for any approaching vehicles. The highway was completely dead in both directions, just empty asphalt disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlights. That's when I noticed the driver's door was slightly ajar, maybe an inch or two, like someone had pulled the handle but hadn't pushed it fully open. The interior dome light wasn't on, which meant either the bulb was out or someone had deliberately disabled it. I grabbed my flashlight, unclipped my holster retention strap out of habit, and stepped out into the thick night air. The walk to the Camry felt longer than it should have, maybe 20 steps that stretched out like a mile. My boots crunched on the gravel shoulder, and I could hear crickets in the tall grass beside the road, their rhythm almost hypnotic. As I approached the driver's side, I kept my flashlight low, using proper approach technique while announcing myself. "State Police, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them." No response. The door was definitely cracked open, and through the gap I could smell something strange. Not marijuana or alcohol, but something medicinal and sharp, like hospital disinfectant mixed with copper. I reached for the door handle with my left hand while keeping my right near my weapon, then slowly pulled it open. The driver's seat was empty, completely empty. The engine was still running, the radio playing some talk show at barely audible volume. And there on the dashboard was a cell phone, screen lit up showing an active call to 911. The timer showed 17 seconds and counting. My training kicked in before my brain could fully process what I was seeing. I immediately stepped back, scanning the immediate area while calling it in. "Dispatch, I've got an abandoned vehicle, engine running, no driver present. There's a cell phone here with an active 911 call." Betty's response came through with static. "Michael, that's the 7th call. It just connected 40 seconds ago." The math didn't add up. I'd been watching this car for at least 2 minutes before approaching. Nobody had gotten out. I swept my flashlight across the passenger seat, the back seats, even the floor. Everything was pristine, untouched, except for one detail that made my throat go dry. The driver's seat was still warm, and the seatbelt was buckled. Not just buckled, but adjusted to fit someone roughly my height, and when I looked closer, there were fresh indent marks in the leather like someone had been sitting there moments ago. I backed away from the vehicle and did a full 360-degree scan of the area. The shoulder dropped off into a drainage ditch about 4 feet deep, filled with kudzu and brambles so thick you couldn't see the bottom. On the other side of the highway, there was nothing but pine forest, the trees packed so tight their trunks looked like prison bars in my flashlight beam. If someone had run into those woods, I would have heard them crashing through the underbrush. If they'd gone into the ditch, they'd still be fighting through those vines. The phone on the dashboard suddenly went dead, exactly at 17 seconds, just like Betty had described. Then, while I was still staring at it, it started dialing 911 again on its own. Not a pocket dial, not a malfunction. I could see the screen clearly showing someone navigating through the phone app, selecting the keypad, and deliberately entering 911, except nobody was touching it. My mouth went completely dry as I watched invisible fingers tap the green call button. Betty's voice crackled through my radio again, but this time she sounded panicked. "Michael, we just got another unit's dashcam footage from earlier tonight. A cruiser passed that same Camry going southbound 3 hours ago near exit 15. She paused and I could hear her breathing heavily. "Michael, the footage shows someone in the driver's seat, but the thermal imaging isn't picking up any heat signature. The person-shaped figure in the seat is reading the same temperature as the air around it." I was already moving back to my cruiser when she continued. "We ran the plate history. That car's been spotted on traffic cameras at 14 different locations tonight, always driving exactly the speed limit, always staying in the right lane. Michael, Harold Simmons died 6 weeks ago. Heart attack at his home in Brookfield. His family reported the car stolen from his driveway 3 days after the funeral, but then they called back the next morning to say it had returned on its own, parked exactly where it had been, with an extra 47 miles on the odometer. I was processing this information when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car door closing. Not slamming, just a gentle, deliberate click. I spun around to see the Camry's driver door was now shut. The phone was gone from the dashboard. The engine was still running, but now the car was in gear, creeping forward at maybe 2 miles per hour along the shoulder. I ran toward it, grabbed the door handle, and yanked it open. The smell hit me harder this time, that medicinal copper scent so strong it made my eyes water. The seat was ice cold now, like it had been refrigerated, and there were wet marks on the leather that weren't there before. They looked like condensation marks, the kind you get when something frozen sits in a warm place. But the pattern was specific. The outline of thighs, lower back, shoulder blades, human-shaped. The car kept rolling forward, and when I reached in to grab the wheel, my hand touched something wet and viscous on the steering wheel, clear and thick like medical gel. I managed to throw the car into park and kill the engine, then stumbled back to my cruiser to call for backup. My hands were numb where I'd touched that substance, and I could see my breath in the August heat every time I exhaled near where it had made contact with my skin. Betty was trying to tell me something about more cameras, more sightings, but I couldn't focus because I'd just noticed something in my peripheral vision. The Camry's trunk had popped open just slightly, maybe an inch. I hadn't touched it, hadn't hit any button. I approached it slowly, my service weapon drawn now because protocol had gone out the window. When I lifted the trunk fully open with my flashlight, I found medical equipment, IV bags filled with that clear gel, tubes, monitoring devices I didn't recognize. Everything was connected to a car battery with modified cables, still running, still pumping that substance through tubes that led to nowhere. They just ended in mid-air, like they should have been connected to something that wasn't there anymore. That's when I saw the notebook, tucked between 2 of the IV bags. It was a medical chart with Harold Simmons' name at the top, but the dates were all wrong. Entries from after his death, detailed notes about treatment, vital signs, medication schedules. The handwriting got progressively worse as the entries went on, from neat medical script to barely legible scratches. The last entry was from that night, just the time 2:47 a.m. and a single word, driving. I was photographing everything with my phone when I heard voices coming from the woods. Not calling for help, not trying to hide, just having a normal conversation like 2 people walking through a forest at 3 a.m. was perfectly reasonable. I called out, identified myself as police, but the voices just continued their casual discussion about medical procedures, about keeping tissue viable, about transport windows. They were getting closer, and I could hear branches snapping, but my flashlight beam couldn't find them. The voices were maybe 30 feet away when they suddenly stopped mid-sentence, like someone had hit a pause button. The backup units arrived 14 minutes later, 2 state cruisers and an ambulance I hadn't requested. They found me standing by my car, weapon drawn, watching the tree line. The Camry was exactly as I'd described, but when they went to examine the trunk, all the medical equipment was gone. Just an empty trunk with no sign it had ever contained anything. The only evidence was the photos on my phone and the residue on my hands that the paramedics couldn't identify. They took samples, but the lab lost them somehow. The Camry was impounded, but it disappeared from the lot that same night. Cameras mysteriously offline for exactly 17 minutes. Harold Simmons's family called the next morning to report the car was back in their driveway again. 47 more miles on the odometer. They sold it to a dealership the next day, and I heard it's been sold 3 times since then. Each owner reports the same thing. Sometimes they wake up to find it's been driven during the night, always exactly 47 miles, always returning before dawn. I transferred to day shift after that and eventually left the force entirely. I still can't explain what happened that night, but sometimes when I'm driving alone and see a silver Camry in my rearview mirror doing exactly the speed limit, I take the next exit. The radio crackled to life just as I passed the abandoned Sinclair station on State Road 78, breaking through 3 hours of absolute silence. Rural Nebraska at night can mess with your head. Nothing but cornfields stretching into darkness, broken up by the occasional farmhouse porch light miles in the distance. Deputy sheriff wasn't exactly my dream job, but after the divorce, those night shift overtime hours were keeping me afloat with the alimony payments. That Friday in late May 2018 had been dead quiet until dispatch patched through an emergency call at 2:47 a.m. The whole county only had about 15,000 people spread across 900 square miles, so when something real happened out here, you remembered it. And what happened that night still makes me question everything I thought I knew about my job. The woman's voice coming through dispatch sounded young, maybe mid-20s, and you could hear her trying to keep it together while her car engine roared in the background. She said a black pickup truck had been stalking her for 20 minutes straight, riding her bumper close enough that she could see the driver's silhouette in her rearview mirror, then dropping back 30 feet before accelerating hard and doing it again. The high beams would flash in a pattern. 3 long bursts pause, then 2 short ones like some kind of signal. She'd already tried taking random turns, even pulled into a gas station parking lot. But the truck followed every move. Her location put her at mile marker 23, eastbound in a silver Nissan Altima, with plates starting with 4B. I was running patrol 6 miles behind them, perfect positioning for an intercept. Then she said something that made me floor it. The truck had just made contact with her bumper. Not a full ram, but enough to jolt her forward. The line went dead after that. I pushed the Crown Vic up to 95, watching the mile markers blur past while dispatch tried to reconnect with the caller. Nothing. The asphalt ahead looked like a black river under my headlights, and I kept scanning for any sign of taillights. At mile marker 21, I finally saw them. 2 vehicles about a quarter mile ahead, the rear one swerving slightly into the oncoming lane before jerking back. The truck was massive, lifted, with those aftermarket LED bars mounted on top that weren't even on. As I closed the distance with lights and sirens going, the whole scene looked wrong somehow. The Altima was maintaining a steady 60 miles per hour, not speeding up or trying to escape, while the truck stayed glued maybe 10 feet behind it. Neither vehicle reacted to my approach at first, like they were locked in some kind of trance, until I got within 100 yards. What happened next still doesn't make sense when I try to piece it together for the reports. The truck's brake lights flared bright red, and it started decelerating hard, forcing me to hit my own brakes to avoid ramming it from behind. Then every light on that truck, headlights, taillights, LED bars, even the cab interior light, shut off simultaneously, like someone had pulled a master switch. The vehicle became a black shape against black road, and before I could process what was happening, it veered sharp right onto a dirt access road between the cornfields. I had to make a split-second decision: follow the aggressor into unknown terrain with no backup for miles, or stick with the victim who might need immediate help. Training kicked in. Secure the victim first. By the time I looked in my side mirror, there was nothing but darkness where that access road met the highway. The Altima kept rolling forward at the exact same speed, never accelerating, never slowing down, like cruise control was engaged. I pulled alongside it, shining my spotlight through the driver's window, and my chest tightened when I saw the steering wheel turning slightly left and right on its own, making micro corrections to keep the car in the lane. The driver's seat was empty. No one in the passenger seat either. The car was driving itself down State Road 78 at 60 miles per hour with nobody inside. I called it into dispatch, hearing my own voice crack as I described what I was seeing. They asked me to repeat it twice, probably thinking I was having some kind of episode. I accelerated past the Altima and gradually moved into its lane, tapping my brakes to force it to slow down. The empty car's automatic emergency braking kicked in, and it finally stopped about 50 yards from my patrol unit. The hazard lights started blinking the moment the car stopped, which made my skin prickle. Someone had to have hit that button. I approached with my weapon drawn, flashlight in my other hand, checking every window before reaching the driver's door. It was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar like someone had jumped out in a hurry, but the wind hadn't caught it yet. The interior dome light was working, illuminating an iPhone still mounted to the dashboard, screen showing an active 911 call that had been running for 8 minutes and 43 seconds. The seat was pushed all the way back, way too far for someone the caller's size based on her voice. A pair of white Adidas sneakers sat neatly on the passenger floor, laces still tied. The engine was running, air conditioning blowing cold, and the radio was playing some pop station at barely audible volume. But what really got me was the smell. Cigarette smoke, fresh, maybe 2 minutes old at most, except there were no cigarettes anywhere in the car. I circled the vehicle with my flashlight, looking for any sign of the driver. The shoulder was just dirt and gravel for about 10 feet before the cornfield started, and those stalks were packed tight, 7 feet tall at least. No footprints in the dirt, which had that crusty surface from the afternoon rain we'd gotten earlier. The only marks were my own boot prints and the car's tire tracks where it had drifted slightly onto the shoulder while stopping. I even checked underneath the car with my flashlight. Nothing but hot asphalt smell and dripping condensation from the AC. Dispatch informed me that backup was still 22 minutes out, coming from the opposite end of the county. They'd managed to trace the phone number from the 911 call to a Brianna Morse, 23, from Lincoln, about 2 hours away. Her phone was still connected to the call, but when dispatch tried talking through it, no one responded. The cornfield started rustling about 30 feet from where I stood, not like wind because everything else was dead still. The sound moved parallel to the road, keeping pace as I walked back toward my patrol car to grab better equipment. That's when I noticed something that made me stop cold. The Altima's odometer was still ticking up, the tenths of a mile digit rolling forward even though the car was in park with the emergency brake engaged. The GPS on the dashboard showed the vehicle's location as moving eastbound at 60 miles per hour, already 3 miles past our actual position. I took a photo with my phone because I knew nobody would believe this. The rustling in the corn got louder, closer, maybe 15 feet away now, and I could hear what sounded like fabric dragging against the stalks. Then my patrol car's radio exploded with static, and through the white noise, I heard a woman's voice, barely audible, saying my badge number over and over again. The thing is, I'd never told the caller my badge number. I drew my weapon and backed toward my patrol car, keeping my eyes on the spot where the corn was moving. The static on my radio cut out abruptly, replaced by dead silence. Then dispatch came through asking if I needed immediate assistance. Before I could respond, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, 2 sets approaching fast from the west. The first was a state trooper I recognized, Tom Aldridge, who must have been closer than the backup dispatch had mentioned. But behind him, keeping perfect pace about 40 yards back, was a black pickup truck with those LED bars on top. The same truck from before, I was certain of it. Tom pulled up behind my unit and got out, asking what the situation was, but I was already pointing at the truck behind him. When we both turned to look, the road was empty. Nothing there but darkness and Tom's own shadow stretching back from my patrol car's headlights. Tom thought I was losing it, until he saw the empty Altima still running, hazards still blinking, and the phone showing that impossible call duration, now at 14 minutes and counting. We searched the cornfield together, walking about 50 yards in with our flashlights creating crazy shadows between the stalks. That's when Tom grabbed my arm and pointed his light downward. There were footprints in the soft soil between the corn rows, bare feet by the look of them, running parallel to the road. But here's what made us both back out of there immediately. The footprints went for about 20 feet, then just stopped. Not like the person turned around or jumped or anything. They just ended in the middle of a row, with undisturbed soil continuing beyond them. We followed our own trail back to the road and found Brianna's iPhone had finally disconnected from the call. The screen showed 37 missed calls from Mom and a text preview that said, "Where are you? Your car is in my driveway." We had the Altima towed to the county impound lot while Tom and I drove to Lincoln to check out the mother's story. The 2-hour drive felt longer with neither of us talking much, both trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Around 5:30 a.m., we pulled up to a small ranch house on the outskirts of Lincoln, where Brianna's mother, Susan, was waiting on the porch in her bathrobe, clearly panicked. She led us to the driveway where a silver Nissan Altima sat parked. Same model as the one we'd just towed, but this one had license plates starting with 7G. Susan swore Brianna had come home around 11 p.m., said she was exhausted from her shift at the hospital, and went straight to bed. We asked to see her, and Susan took us inside, but when she opened Brianna's bedroom door, the bed was empty, still made, with her work scrubs folded neatly on top. The window was locked from the inside, no sign of disturbance anywhere. The real Brianna Morse was reported missing that morning. Her car, the one in her mother's driveway, had her purse and hospital ID badge still in it. The Altima we found on State Road 78 didn't exist in any DMV database. The VIN number came back as invalid, like someone had just made it up. The phone we found wasn't registered to anyone. It had no contacts, no apps, no photos, just that single outgoing 911 call in its history. State police took over the investigation, but after 3 weeks of searching, they found nothing. No black pickup in any registration database matching what we saw. No explanation for the barefoot prints. No trace of Brianna. Tom transferred to a different county 6 months later, said he couldn't drive that stretch of road anymore without feeling sick. I stuck it out another year before putting in for early retirement. The case is still open, technically, but nobody talks about it at the department. Sometimes I drive past that spot on State Road 78, always during daylight, and I swear the corn seems to lean toward the road there, even when there's no wind. I remember that night so clearly because it started like any other patrol shift and ended up being one of the strangest calls I've ever answered in my years on the force. I was assigned to the late shift, the kind that always drags a little slower, and I'd just been sitting in my cruiser going through the usual dispatch chatter when the call came through. Multiple neighbors had dialed 911 about screams coming from a unit on the 3rd floor of an old apartment building downtown. It wasn't unusual to get noise complaints or even the occasional fight, but the dispatcher emphasized how frantic the callers sounded. That's what pushed me to get there fast. The building itself had a reputation, at least among some of us at the precinct. It was one of those old brick complexes from the 1940s, with narrow hallways that smelled like mildew and broken mailboxes stuffed with flyers. People moved in and out constantly, and I'd responded to domestic disputes there before. When I pulled up, the lot was half lit by a flickering lamppost, and a few tenants were huddled outside near the entrance. They looked uneasy, whispering to each other, and when they saw me, one older guy pointed up to the 3rd floor without saying a word. It was clear I was walking into something different. Inside, the stairwell creaked under my boots as I climbed up. The walls were lined with peeling paint, water stains forming odd shapes that somehow made the place look even more unsettling. By the time I reached the third floor, I could hear a faint hum from a television echoing down the hall. Apartment 3C had its door half shut but not latched, the blue glow of the screen spilling through the crack. I called out police before stepping closer, half expecting someone to open it and start yelling at me. But the only reply was the low drone of the TV and the smell of something burnt wafting through the air. Pushing the door open, I noticed the details right away, things that didn't add up. A pot was still sitting on the stove, smoke curling from whatever had been left unattended inside, like someone walked away mid-cooking. Plates were laid out on the counter, as if dinner was just about to be served. The TV was blasting a late-night game show, and a jacket hung over the back of the couch. It looked like someone had just stepped out for a second, except the neighbors swore they heard blood-curdling screams. That contradiction hit me harder than I care to admit, and the silence of the place was thick enough that I caught myself holding my breath without realizing it. I moved further inside, announcing myself again, louder this time. The sound of my own voice bounced off the walls, too sharp against the quiet. The bedroom door was wide open, sheets tossed on the bed like someone had gotten up in a hurry. In the bathroom, the sink was running with a thin trickle of water, steam fogging up the small mirror above it. I shut the faucet, listening carefully, and that's when I heard it. 3 distinct thuds. Not heavy footsteps, not furniture shifting, but more like fists against drywall. It came from the living room wall, just a few feet from where I was standing. I pressed my ear close to the spot, half convinced I'd find a pipe knocking or maybe a neighbor messing around next door. But the rhythm wasn't mechanical. It was uneven, desperate. 2 knocks, then silence, then a muffled scrape. The hairs on my arms stood up as I realized it wasn't coming from the neighboring unit. It was from inside the wall itself. I stepped back, trying to steady my breathing, and glanced toward the apartment door, wondering if I should call in backup before tearing through the place. Another bang cut through the air, harder this time, shaking a picture frame loose from its nail. It clattered to the floor near my boots, the glass cracking across the smiling faces of some family photo. I shouted again, demanding whoever was in there identify themselves. The only answer was more pounding, now moving along the wall toward the kitchen, as if something or someone was crawling behind the plaster. I couldn't wrap my head around how that was even possible, but every instinct told me the tenant hadn't just walked out. I pulled out my radio to request additional units, but before I could key it, a voice slipped through the static of the TV. Not a show host anymore, not the game show laughter. It was faint, almost buried beneath the noise, but I caught it, a man's strained voice repeating, "Help me." The sound wasn't synced with the broadcast. It seemed to be leaking through the speakers in short bursts. My stomach tightened as I realized the calls weren't from a neighbor guessing. Someone really was trapped, and I was standing in the only place where the walls themselves seemed to breathe. I drew closer to the kitchen wall where the banging had shifted. The cabinets rattled slightly with each strike, like the force was pushing through from the other side. I tapped the drywall with my knuckles, and instantly another knock responded in sync. That moment confirmed it. Someone was back there. I shouted that help was on the way, though my voice cracked a little more than I wanted. My radio finally came alive, and I quickly called for backup and maintenance to bring tools. While I waited, I kept talking, trying to reassure whoever was trapped, even though they never spoke back again. Minutes stretched like hours until the second unit arrived. 2 other officers rushed in, and with their help, we pulled the stove away from the wall and started working the panel behind it. The drywall crumbled easily, and what we uncovered made the air in the room feel heavier. There was a hollow space, not a simple utility gap, an actual crawl area that shouldn't have existed according to the building's design. Inside, wedged against the beams, was a man in his late 20s, covered in dust and trembling violently. His fingernails were bloody, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He gasped when we reached for him, like he'd been holding his breath for hours. We pulled him out carefully, and the smell that followed was unbearable, stale air mixed with rot, as if that space had been sealed for decades. He clung to my arm with surprising strength, eyes darting around the apartment as if expecting someone else to crawl out after him. He didn't explain how he'd gotten in there or why, and in truth, none of us pressed him too hard in that moment. The paramedics who arrived later kept asking questions, but the man just repeated the same broken phrase. He put me there. No name, no explanation, just that. The apartment was sealed off for investigation, and I never did learn the full story. The building manager swore there was no record of any hidden crawl spaces, and the maintenance staff had no idea those walls were hollow. Reports were filed, but the case went nowhere, like so many strange ones do. To this day, when I think back on that night, the detail that sticks with me isn't the banging or the smell. It's the sound of that faint voice slipping through the TV, begging for help. I can't explain it, and maybe I never will, but I know what I heard, and I'll never forget pulling a living person out of a wall that shouldn't have existed. I rented a small place in a rundown apartment complex a few years back, when money was tight and I was just trying to keep a roof over my head. The building was one of those beige, peeling rectangles with flickering hallway lights and thin walls where you could hear every neighbor's argument. Rent was cheap, and that was the only reason most of us stayed. People came and went all the time, but there was this strange pattern. Residents would suddenly move out overnight, leaving behind furniture, clothes, even food in the fridge. Management always claimed they left in a hurry or skipped rent, but the way entire units sat untouched made no sense. I kept to myself mostly. I was working odd shifts at a warehouse, and the last thing I wanted was drama with neighbors. Still, I noticed little things. A family down the hall vanished without warning. 2 kids, a tired mom who always smelled of cigarettes, and a dad who used to nod at me in the stairwell. One morning, their door was locked with the chain on the inside, but no one ever answered again. A week later, maintenance guys were moving their belongings into dumpsters. No notice, no U-Haul, no goodbye. It rattled me, but in that building you learned quickly not to ask too many questions. The maintenance supervisor, Mr. Dalton, was an odd figure. He was always around, no matter what hour of the day you came or went. He had this jangling key ring that seemed heavy enough to weigh down his whole belt, and he wore coveralls stained with paint and grease, like he never owned another outfit. He'd strike up conversations in the hall that were just a little too long, like he wanted to know exactly when you'd be home or gone. Once, he asked me directly if I ever had trouble sleeping at night in my unit. At the time, I laughed it off, thinking he was just making small talk, but it stuck in my head. Things escalated the night I came home late and heard scraping noises in the walls of my bedroom. At first I thought it was rats, which wouldn't have surprised me in that place. But when I pressed my ear against the wall, the sound was rhythmic, almost deliberate, like wood shifting against metal. I followed it down to the corner near the floor, where the carpet bulged slightly. That was when I realized the noise wasn't coming from inside the wall. It was coming from beneath the floor. The following day, I asked the neighbor across the hall if she ever heard strange noises. Her name was Linda, an older woman who spent most of her time knitting by the window. She told me in a hushed voice that she heard people whispering at night through the vents, conversations that didn't belong to anyone she knew in the building. She said she once woke up to the sound of heavy boots directly beneath her bed, even though her apartment was on the 2nd floor. The way she looked at me, wide eyes, lips trembling, made it clear she wasn't joking. It unnerved me so badly that I slept with my lamp on that night. 2 weeks later, a unit on the 1st floor was sealed off with yellow tape. The police came in unmarked cars, no sirens, no noise. They carried evidence boxes out and spoke in low voices. When I asked Dalton what happened, he smirked and said, "Routine inspection, nothing you need to worry about." But his eyes didn't leave mine, as if he was daring me to ask again. That same night, I heard the scraping return, louder and longer this time, like someone dragging a tool along metal. It kept going until 3 in the morning. Eventually, word spread that detectives had found something beneath the building. They didn't announce it to everyone, but rumors traveled fast in a place like that. One tenant swore they saw police hauling ladders, flashlights, and crowbars into the basement. Another claimed they watched officers crawl into a hatch hidden behind the boiler room. I couldn't shake the image of Dalton's keys, how they seemed endless, how he always looked like he knew more about the building than anyone else. What really broke me was when I woke up one night to the sound of my own lock clicking, slowly, like someone was testing it. I sat up in bed, heart racing, staring at the doorknob as it rattled gently, then went still. The next morning, there was nothing. No scratch marks, no damage, just silence in the hallway. When I confronted Dalton, his response chilled me. Doors don't always keep people safe around here. He said it casually, almost like a joke, but I could tell he meant it. Detectives eventually went public after another disappearance drew too much attention. They announced that a hidden system of crawl spaces and tunnels had been discovered beneath the building, connecting units through the walls and floors. The place had been modified years earlier, not by contractors but by Dalton himself. He had cut hidden access points behind closets, under sinks, even through the elevator shaft. The idea that he'd been crawling through those spaces while we slept made me sick to my core. When they arrested him, the news spread like wildfire. They said he admitted to checking in on tenants at night, watching them through vents or cracks he created. The abductions weren't random. He picked people who lived alone, who wouldn't be missed right away. Some victims were found alive in a locked storage area in the basement, disoriented and terrified, while others were never located. It was the kind of story you'd expect from a horror movie, not the place where I'd been paying rent. I moved out within days of the arrest, breaking my lease without a second thought. I didn't care about losing my deposit or owing fees. The last night I spent there, I barely closed my eyes. Every creak in the floorboards felt like someone shifting beneath me. I sat with my back against the wall, staring at the door, until daylight broke through the grimy blinds. By then, I already had my car packed with everything I owned. To this day, I still can't stay in apartments with paper-thin walls or strange maintenance workers lingering too long in the hallways. I always check the floors, the closets, even the vents before I unpack. People tell me to let it go, that Dalton is locked away for good, but they weren't the ones who heard whispers through the vents or locks clicking in the dead of night. That building taught me one thing. Sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under your bed. They're the ones who hold the keys. It was late autumn when everything happened. The kind of season where the mornings carried a bite in the air and the evenings felt heavier than usual. I had been with the department for nearly 9 years, working mostly traffic-related cases. Nothing that stood out beyond the usual accidents and reckless driving. That morning, I was assigned to investigate a single-vehicle crash on a state highway. A black sedan had swerved into the guardrail, leaving one driver dead at the scene. On the surface, it seemed like another tragic accident, but from the moment I arrived, something about it gnawed at me. The driver was a man in his 30s named Matthew Price. His car was still resting against the twisted rail when I got there. Windshield cracked, front bumper crushed inward. What stuck with me wasn't the damage itself, but the silence that hung over the scene. Usually there's debris scattered wide, maybe skid marks to tell a story, but here the patterns didn't add up. The gouges on the asphalt suggested a deliberate push rather than a loss of control. I remember crouching by the driver's side door, brushing aside tiny shards of glass, and spotting his dash cam wired neatly near the rearview mirror. For some reason, I knew I had to pull it. Back at the station, I plugged the memory card into my workstation. The footage loaded without delay, showing Matthew driving calmly, headlights from other cars occasionally passing in the opposite lane. About 12 minutes before the crash, 2 vehicles appeared behind him, dark SUVs, unmarked, moving with an unnerving precision. They boxed him in, one to the side, one tailing close, and when he tried to slow down, the lead vehicle cut him off. I sat in my chair watching the moment his sedan clipped the rail, shoved deliberately from the right. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't an accident, it was an execution. I printed stills from the footage, logged the dashcam into evidence, and made a note to escalate. But hours later, when I went back to check the log, every file connected to the case was gone. Not misplaced, gone. The entry that I had personally uploaded showed as if it had never existed. Confused, I walked straight to my supervisor, Captain Harris, to ask if there had been a transfer. He didn't look surprised. He just leaned back in his chair, hands clasped too neatly, and told me, "Close the file, Ryan. You've seen what you needed to see." I remember standing in his office longer than I should have, trying to figure out if he was testing me, if this was some kind of loyalty drill. But his eyes didn't flicker, not once. He didn't ask what I had seen or how I got it. He already knew. That detail rattled me more than anything. If he knew, it meant I wasn't the first to stumble onto something like this. I walked out with my jaw tight, pretending to accept his word. But my mind kept replaying the footage frame by frame. 2 SUVs, no plates visible, moving like a trained unit. Whoever they weren't random aggressors on a highway. By evening, I checked my locker where I'd stashed the printed stills, the only backup I had made before logging the footage. The envelope was still there, but when I flipped through the prints, 2 sheets were missing. The exact frames where the SUV rammed Matthew's sedan. That's when I understood this wasn't sloppy file handling. Someone had direct access, not only to the digital log, but to my personal storage inside the precinct. My skin prickled with the realization that the walls around me weren't safe. I drove home restless, the steering wheel damp from the grip of my palms. My neighborhood was quiet, porch lights glowing in familiar rows. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. At one point, I noticed a dark vehicle parked 2 houses down from mine. Lights off, windows tinted. I circled the block once to test it, and when I came back, it was gone. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. Every nerve told me it wasn't. I barely slept that night. Phone pressed against the nightstand, waiting for it to ring with something I couldn't prepare for. The next morning, I went back to the crash site alone. The road was already cleared, the rail patched crudely, like the state wanted to erase any sign of violence. I paced the shoulder, searching for anything overlooked. Paint chips, tire fragments, anything physical. After 20 minutes, I found a small strip of rubber embedded near the guardrail, fresher than the rest of the damage. It wasn't much, but it told me one of those SUVs left something behind. I pocketed it, knowing I couldn't tag it officially, not if I wanted it to survive longer than a few hours. Later that week, Captain Harris called me into his office again. His tone was calmer this time, almost rehearsed, like he wanted to settle a restless dog. He told me the department had other priorities, and that this case would only create noise with no resolution. When I asked directly about the missing footage, he lowered his voice and said, "You don't want to be tied to this, Ryan. People lose careers over chasing ghosts." I left his office without answering, but deep down I understood. The threat wasn't subtle anymore. That evening I copied the strip of rubber I had taken onto my own notes at home, marking the tread patterns by hand. I wasn't a forensic analyst, but I knew enough to tell it wasn't from Matthew's sedan. I considered sending it anonymously to a friend at another precinct, but hesitation kept me still. If someone was watching, the package might never make it to him. Around midnight, I heard a car idle outside my house for nearly 5 minutes before rolling away. That sound, steady engine, deliberate pause, has never left my memory. I never saw the footage again. Weeks later, the official report was filed as loss of control due to driver fatigue. No mention of the SUVs, no mention of mechanical interference. Matthew Price became another line in a spreadsheet of highway deaths. I kept one single still photo tucked in an old case file, hidden where I don't think anyone will search. Sometimes I take it out, stare at the blurred image of headlights surrounding his sedan, and wonder how many other reports have been rewritten the same way. It's been years since that night, and I'm still careful about where I talk about this. Writing it here feels like a risk, but also a release. I've carried the weight of that evidence, the kind that vanishes not because it's untrue, but because it's too true. If I learned anything from that case, it's that some files aren't closed because they're solved. They're closed because someone powerful decided the truth shouldn't live on paper. And if you ever think a highway accident looks too clean, maybe it wasn't an accident at all.